Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right, Sultan. I probably should have put the beard on him. Well, the problem is like the person I'm speaking to didn't have a PFP, so I couldn't put it on the other guy's face like I usually do. So I could only do this. Hang on, let me close the door one sec. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so this was like a difficult conversation to get off the ground because I had like two people lined up and it both fell through. And then we finally got a hold of someone who would like to come on. I'm going to call him in right now. And then we'll get him on in a second. And then we'll kind of, I'll go over like the general gist of what we're going to talk about once he's on. Let's do it. Sweet. All right. Desktop audio. Hello. Sir, Psycho?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Let's see. People, how are the levels? Can you hear us both equally? One is not more than the other.
Hello,
Actually, I
hello,
should turn my gain up a little. There we go. That helps a little bit. Here, say something.
hello, hello,
Okay,
hello.
perfect. We should be good then. Okay, yeah, let's just hop into it. So, first, if you want to introduce yourself, your name, how you want to be addressed, and then we'll go from there.
Cool. I guess we can do it on some old 2000s hacker movie type stuff. I'll go as a psycho or psychosomatic, whatever you prefer. Um, yeah, my name's Psychosomatic. Been on basically a viewer on YouTube for a minute now, since it's inception. I've been watching your channel for a hot minute. Really enjoy your content. Um, uh, can't wait to get into this discussion about masculinity, or I guess in this case, I guess people demonizing masculinity.
Yeah,
That's the
so
case.
we can sort of explore that. So yeah, my apologies. The title it came because I know we sort of discussed something a little bit different. We'll get into that. But the
Mm,
original person who I was gonna chat with had mentioned that they believe masculinity, or rather traditional masculinity, is
mm,
demonized in current society, which in
mm,
turn is the cause of a lot of issues that a lot of young men are going through. They're kind of because that traditional path is demonized, men won't follow it, which leads to them being scared and confused. Now,
okay.
as someone who I was like, I go over in some other videos, I was I was not really alt right, but I kind of like flirted with like some of those things. But
Same here.
Jordan,
I
yeah,
get it.
which a lot of guys I think, especially who've been online for the last few years, you kind of, especially if you're on YouTube in like your late teens, yeah,
Hmm.
definitely. But
Yeah. Whole what you call alt right or anti SJW trend from
yeah,
like
that's
the
maybe that's a
late
better
2010s.
yeah, because alt right kind of has a more like like a more extremist view. So maybe anti or a more extremist connotation, I should say. So maybe like
Yeah.
anti SJW, kind of like guys who kind of flirt with these ideas but like aren't really like sold on them.
Yeah.
But I was actually a big fan of Jordan Peterson content. My feelings on
Hmm.
him today are mixed, but one
Hmm.
of the things that I really got from him, and I kind of that he used to talk about a lot, was how masculinity is sort of demonized or downplayed in a society. And this
Hmm.
is a sentiment I've heard echoed in the red pill community, the pickup artist community, MGTOW, yada yada yada, the manosphere, if you will. And if you had asked me about a year ago, if like, hey, do you think that masculinity is demonized in society?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, I would have said yes.
Hmm.
Now it's and just recently I've kind of gotten to the point where I started sort of like interrogating that idea. Is masculinity actually quote unquote demonized in society?
Hmm.
As evidenced by men sort of falling behind in education, socially, romantically, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And
Hmm.
the issue I had was that when I kind of tried to like interrogate that belief I had, I kind of came up empty in terms of evidence supporting the idea that masculinity is demonized. Now, of course,
Hmm.
that men are not doing well in today's society, but
Hmm.
that isn't to say that the reason for that is the demonization of masculinity. So that's kind of what I kind of wanted to discuss. And I know, like, at least with the first person, that's what I was going to do. But
Hmm.
I wanted to get kind of your take. So would you say? So yeah. So what is your take on that? I think we can agree that of the descriptive claim that
Hmm.
young men in today's society aren't doing well. Like a lot of guys are really struggling. But now the question is, what is the cause of that?
Yes, very much as someone who is also a fan or a, I'd say, on and off fan of Jordan Peterson. I like a lot of his work. I don't know. I'll have people like friends or coworkers, like I'll be like, oh, I kind of like Jordan. He'll be like, oh, well, what about this thing that he said, this questionable thing, and I'll be like, I didn't know that. So it's very much like a things that like the Bruce Lee philosophy of take what works, leave the rest, in my opinion. But in terms of that, I agree that men in, I'm going to say, I guess, a Western
Mm-hmm.
culture context. And also, by the way, I am one to kind of to ramble every now and again, just because I try and come into these conversations more trying to go through the ideas. So if I ramble a bit too much, curse me out. It's more than fine.
I don't want to do that. I'll just kind of like I'll kind of maybe interrupt you and just kind of bring you back. I that because
No
that happens to
problem.
me. That happens to me sometimes too. So if I go off, don't be afraid to do that for me either.
No problem. I appreciate it. But I do agree that men we're not doing too well in terms of in Western culture. I can't really speak for other cultures, but in terms of the West. Now in terms of the cause of that, I think it's a multitude of things. I think it's one of those things where you'll have different groups kind of like pick their biggest reason that falls in line with their biggest demon that they're fighting. But I think it's one of those, it's a whole, what's a good term, microcosm of issues. And then to specifically get into it, I guess demonization of masculinity in and of itself, I feel like that plays a part. Now, I'm not one of those guys who's like, yeah, everywhere you go, there's somebody yelling at a man and all these men in dresses. Like, I don't personally, I'm a live and let live type of dude. Um, so, but in terms, whenever I start these conversations, I guess the question would be, how would we define masculinity first? Where a lot of people will go into, well, a lot of people don't like to answer the question with like a specific a definition. They'll go basically into how they feel, where it'll be a, well, most men today aren't acting like Stone Cold Steve Austin in the 90s, and that's a problem. Where it's like, okay, cool. I I guess it's one of those times change situation. I kind of miss that type of man myself. I, as someone who grew up on wrestling, I kind of miss that era of like outlaw type. Like every boy wanted to be like some type of outlaw and dudes fighting and all that type of stuff. Um, but I mean that's kind of more so a on the surface kind of thing. And then more so deeply, I guess my definition of masculinity would be like men being the teachers of the main teachers of logic and order and the main protectors. And I feel like that's basically the most bare that I can put masculinity into. So in terms of the demonization of that masculinity, there I find there to be some fringe groups, kind of like I guess femcells or I guess whatever the female equivalent of the alt right or some fringe leftist groups who
They kind of like rad femmes, like women who kind of feel
exactly
like, you know,
men,
men
how
are
dare
like
you,
all men are
like
oppressors and they have a very
it,
hostile attitude towards men.
exactly, where it's very much like a, oh, something bad happened to me or possibly happened to me as a woman in the past. Man did something to me, now I hold all men to the, or yeah, I hold all men to that standard of you're a demon until I say you're not.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
if you do anything that I deem as the old SJW buzzword or buzz phrase, toxic masculinity, then it's like all men are garbage, all that type of stuff. As someone who's also have tried to find claims for this, like I used to be deep into this type of content too. Like I can rattle off a whole bunch of names of just going into whole anti-SJW craze. And as someone who also tried to go into it, I have found more answers. However, my reality is a bit more skewed in a certain direction as a Black American male. I find there to be a lot of, in terms of demonization of masculinity of me growing up, I have seen, and by the way, I'm 25, so I'm fairly still young, not old, but I remember it's a lot of more anecdotal of boys being raised by single mothers, and those single mothers, where a lot of the times they were hurt by the men that they had children with, right? Rather they were left by them, or they maybe ran them off by being overbearing in their own ways, downloaded that hatred onto their sons, where a lot of it, including stuff I grew up with, would be like, oh, is it okay if I curse, or do you want me to?
Oh, I don't care. But just to
Oh,
let's the kind of just before we get too far into the weeds, kind of like you mentioned before, like how do we define masculinity?
okay, yeah.
So it's difficult because from a just from like a straight up objective standpoint, if we're trying to actually just find like whatever the definition,
Hmm.
like whatever masculine means, it's whatever the norm is at the time.
Yeah.
However, the problem with the reason I don't really like using this definition is that these, depending on what you're using, it will shift over time. So, for example,
Yeah.
I had a conversation with a commenter in my latest video, the
Hmm.
Reject Modernity, Embrace Masculinity video, and
Hmm.
he said something of the like, "There's nothing, there is no way a man in a skirt or a dress can be masculine."
Hmm.
Well, the issue there is that in terms of like today, like in our current society, yes, like being wearing a dress or makeup is not seen as masculine, and that is
Hmm.
true in our current society. The problem there is that if we go back to say the founding fathers days,
Hmm.
we will see like all the founding fathers, like all these men who were revered, they're wearing wigs and
Wearing makeup.
shields and
And
tights and
yeah.
makeup. And so, okay, so in that case, those sort of more like, what's the word I'm looking for? Surface level things like physical
Hmm.
appearance, stuff like that. That doesn't seem to be a good indicator because even today,
Hmm.
if we go across the world, men's fashion and customs,
It's all different.
makeup, clothes, it's all different. So when we're talking about masculinity, I usually try to stick to things that are kind of like so. If we go back to the founding fathers, what were certain things that we look back upon them for? Like, I mean, like I don't think a lot of them are good people, but like in
Hmm.
like more like the myth of them, it's that they were courageous, they stood up for what they believed in.
Brave. Yeah.
Yeah,
They were.
stuff like that. Now, and just to be certain, just to be clear, when I talk about masculinity, I don't think that it is in opposition to femininity. I think a big
No.
issue a lot of people have is that they see femininity and masculinity as opposites. So
Opposites instead of
yeah,
something that kind of goes together like two
they're
pieces of a puzzle.
or like two sides of the same coin. Like it's sort
Yeah.
of like someone would say, "Oh, you're saying courage or strength is a masculine trait. Are you saying cowardice or
And,
weakness is
and
a female trait?"
weakness.
Like
Being,
no, that's not. It's a better way to put it. Like there are manly traits and there are like boyish traits. I think like immature traits. I think that's a better way to put it. So
yeah.
yeah. So what kind of frustrates me is that it seems like the whole reason this brought about was that I was watching those Reject Modernity, Embrace Masculinity videos, and it seemed
Mm.
like you had all these men, and what they were doing was they were looking at these men who were either, LGBTQ, trans, uh,
Mm.
who like to wear dress or makeup or something, and in
Mm.
accordance with those physical attributes, like their physical appearance,
Mm.
they would make judgments of their character. It's like, oh, this person is weak
Yes.
because he's wearing a dress or he's wearing makeup. And that really bugged me because you're kind of making a leap there. Like
Yeah.
as someone who was in like the bodybuilding lifting scene, I can tell you a lot of the biggest, strongest guys you meet are some of the most fragile, insecure guys you'll also
Ever.
ever meet. Um, so yeah, and that's sort of why, and it's difficult because then I see guys say it's like, well, because we see a rise of guys who are, like we see a rise of trans people and guys acting more traditionally feminine, like with dresses or whatever.
Mm,
They kind of take that as, oh, like masculinity as we knew it or as we know it is either
dying.
being attacked or dying, and it's a thought process very present in like the manosphere,
Yeah.
and it's it kind of gets scary because I almost kind of feel like, for lack of like a better term, a lot of young guys are kind of like almost gaslighting themselves into believing that they're like that there's like this attack, like there's like a coordinated effort to try and like emasculate them or like make them women that I just don't really see that doesn't really match up with reality, I guess.
It's a lot of dudes having to, like, to go off on the single mother thing from before, it's a lot of dudes having to grow up and kind of teach themselves masculinity, where they have these ideas. Someone had a video about, I think his name was Glink. He had a video on kind of like father figures of YouTube. Obviously, Jordan Peterson being one of them, but also people like Joe Rogan and Jocko Willink. I want
Mm-hmm.
to say his name is. It's a lot of dudes taking their masculinity philosophies from these guys, and then they're learning, but which we call like obviously they're not exactly like an apprenticeship or anything like with these actual people, so then they have to figure it out as they go along, which then allows them to be corrupted, or I guess I can say corrupted by these manosphere types, whether it be like the pickup community or which we'll call like these women just are there to be laid and cook and nothing else type groups, where then it's a lot of stuff that you want to hear, not necessarily you specifically or anything like that, like just the general person. Like when you're learning this stuff, it's like you have the power as a man. Like this is you. And it's like anything else is like against you. It's very weird. So it's a lot of these dudes who are doing what you say, they're doing that. They're having to learn what masculinity is themselves instead of having that teacher, whether it be a father figure, like their actual father or an uncle or someone else to kind of help guide them through that. Where even saying that, it's like I don't like as someone who had to go through that, like trying to figure out masculinity for themselves and how I see it in the open world, like I'll see, dudes dressing up in dresses to be more feminine. And it just kind of reminds me of the whole androgynous movement of the 80s, where Prince will dress up in a blouse, but and he's like 5'4", but he can pick up any woman that he wants. Like and day to day, he's still very deep. See him in any interview, he's very much like I do this and or he'll have like the sass every now and then, but
Yeah, that
he's
so in that
himself.
case, yeah, so perfect. It's like, and because I hear that a lot where people are like, oh, they'll look at guys in like dresses or makeup and they'll
Mm,
say like, oh, this guy is unmanly. And the issue there is that like maybe like in terms of our like general social customs, he would be deemed
mm,
more feminine. The problem
mm,
is that, or I would say a problem, but like at least in my view, is that since I view masculinity based on like values like
yeah,
confidence, courage, self assuredness, in a way, I actually think isn't that like you could even make the argument, isn't this even more masculine in the sense of a man, like say, like take Prince, like if a
yes,
guy is able to sort of like go against the grain and say, actually, I'm not. It's socially acceptable for me to be like buff and macho and wear certain clothes, but I
mm,
don't feel like it, and I want to wear this and look like this and do this, and
mm,
I'm going to defy convention, societal constraints, and do this, even if people call me gay or a fruit or whatever.
yeah,
That to me is a very masculine, or at least my view of masculinity. I think that is a
Mm.
far more masculine outlook.
It's funny
And
enough, it's like that outlaw kind of trait of
it's
being that rebel.
it's ironic, right? How like aren't these guys doing the most like rebellious thing? Like, isn't that a big part of like traditional masculinity? It's kind of like
Mm.
going against society not like telling you what to do.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of these guys, like you're right, they kind of, and I understand it, like a part of the reason why they get kind of like into Joe Rogan, like these like very traditionally masculine figures, Jordan Peterson, like these kind of
Mm.
father figures. It makes sense.
Mm.
However, it kind of is ironic that it sometimes feels like isn't it kind of weird that you're talking about like because like even Joe Rogan, he's someone who I think a lot of his quote unquote masculinity is defined by anti-authoritarian, like going against the grain of society, like walking your own
Yeah.
path. And the irony is that it seems like a lot of guys kind of get sucked in. They end up like buying into that and they just
Mm.
ascribe to it because they think that's how to be a man, even though it's kind of antithetical to the entire point of doing your own thing and figuring out your own path. You're literally just listening to guys online telling you how to be a man and listening to them.
It's it just shows you that there's a lot of men who are still on that first kind of step in terms of finding about out what masculinity is, where
Mm-hmm.
you have a lot of people who, or not a lot, maybe, I don't know, other men, maybe older or men who are around like us who are kind of figuring out that masculinity kind of takes different forms. Like it could be, it'll be the same idea, but it takes multiple forms of that. Where that once again, it's like both of our. It sounds like we have a similar idea of masculinity, of that kind of rebellious outlaw, going your own way, making your like being a trailblazer in your own life,
Yeah,
and then
self assuredness. I think is like whatever you do, you're doing it
exactly.
knowing that you're confident.
Exactly. So whether it be like a Prince or once again, I keep bringing his name up, like a Stone Cold Steve Austin, you have those ideas. It's on the same, I guess, spectrum of masculinity where you have this tough guy on the left, this kind of like emotionally tough guy on the right, and they're both, I don't know, they kind of come into each other. And it's like, okay, masculinity wise, they both can be masculine. Now, then you can get into the more superficial, like, okay, like what then does it look like? Like the fashion of it look like? Some
Yeah,
obviously for the
if
majority,
we
it's gonna.
if we look at say a guy like Stone Cold Steve Austin and a guy like Prince,
Uh,
these are two men who stylistically, like in terms of their how they
can't
look,
be any
their
more
like
different.
muscle mass, they couldn't be any more different. However, what is it that draws us to them, or what is it that like makes them compelling? It's they're rocking it. This is
Yeah.
who I am. I'm confident in who I am, and I'm just rocking it no matter what. And even if that person, whether it's a dude wearing a dress or a dude wearing a leather jacket, whatever, I think that kind of draws us to those people. That's sort of what we're talking
Yes.
about self assuredness. And I think you're right on the money. Is that a lot of guys are still they never really kind of because like so here's my general theory after thinking about it. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
that it's so much that masculinity is being demonized in society. I think a lot of guys
Mm-hmm.
feel like that, which I'll get to in a
Mm-hmm.
second. I think the
Mm-hmm.
difference is that back in like say like the 50s or 60s, there was
Mm-hmm.
a very there was a far more rigid view of what we thought masculinity was. There were very defined roles for men and women about like, hey, this is
Mm-hmm.
what women do, this is what men do. Now, as restrictive as that is, I do think in a
Mm-hmm.
way it is comforting. Because if you're a young
Yes.
man growing up and the world is telling you, hey, you have to act like a man, and then someone tells you, hey, here is a guidebook on how to be a man based on society,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
even if it's restrictive, it is kind of comforting. You kind of feel guided. You kind of feel like
Yes.
you're on the right path.
Yes.
What's happened over the last 50 or so years is that our society has said not demonize society. Like obviously like there are those who like actually like fuck man and like all that stuff, but like we all agree that
Mm-hmm.
those are just like,
Goo goo. Those are
cringeworth.
cuckoos.
Um
Yeah, perfect
yeah,
phrase right there.
and However, what a lot of people in society are saying, it's like, hey, to be considered a man, you don't have to like have bulging muscles. You don't have to wear a leather jacket or like drive fast cars. You can be a man and like knitting. You can be a man and wear makeup. You can be wear a dress.
Mhm.
It's like your masculinity is more defined by being a good person.
Yes.
Now that's all, and that's all well and good. I like that. However, the problem is that now you have men who they come into the world and they kind of are asking like, hey, how do I be a man? Like, how do I become a man? And
Mhm.
and basically everyone's just telling them it's like, well, a man's anything. You can be anything, and that doesn't really help the guys because like if you just say like, hey, how do I be a man? And they're like, well, I don't know. Like you're kind of just
Yeah.
saying you can be a man. It kind of it doesn't allow that kid, that younger guy, to kind of feel like he has any sort of guide as to where to
Mhm.
even start forming his
Yeah.
identity as a man. And so, and because of that, when you have a lot of guys who have sort of defined their masculinity based on certain things, so like there are men out
Mhm.
there who they they're still kind of in that phase where they're not really they're kind of basing their like we all know the type people who base their personality off certain aspects of themselves separate
Good.
from like their personality. So I'm a
Mhm.
man because I like to lift or because I like motorcycles or I like beer and football or something. Like kind of
Yeah,
guys
they
who
were.
aren't yeah, they're kind of still figuring out, they're kind of latching on to things they think make them manly.
They
And
put their
so
masculinity in like Ed Hardy T-shirts and stuff of that. I know those guys. Yep.
yeah. And it's and like not to like throw shade at them, like again, it's a learning process.
Yeah.
But for those guys, when someone comes along and says, "Hey, just because you like football, you can like football, or you can like ballet, or you can wear makeup, or wear like jeans and a t-shirt, and you're
Mhm.
no more or less masculine." I think what's
Mhm.
happening is now, in and of itself, that is not a threat. That's not someone like calling them like obviously like there are like douchebags out there who will
Mhm.
mock them, but those are like
Yeah.
pretty fringe groups. However,
Yeah.
the rest of society is kind of saying, well, you don't have to do this to be considered a man. But because these men have defined their masculinity on these traits, they take the idea like so for example, like I'm trying to think of like a good metaphor. Let's say a guy has like he has like a what's real like a bookshelf, and on the bookshelf there are all the things that he considers things that make him a man. It's like, oh, I'm very fit. I like football. I like whiskey.
Mhm.
Yada yada yada. All these things that make up his confidence and identity as a man. But then someone comes
Yes.
along and says, well, these things don't necessarily make you more or less of a man as a guy who likes anything else. And I
Mhm.
think what it kind of happens is these guys kind of feel as though, even though it's not an explicit threat, by saying that these things don't necessarily make you any more masculine than anyone else, it does kind of
Mhm.
put their own sense of identity as a man into question.
Yeah.
Like, oh, if I've defined my identity as a man because I like football and lifting and whiskey, and then someone comes along and says don't aren't those aren't inherently masculine, then what does that mean? I'm less masculine now? Then my entire identity is put into question. And I kind of
Mhm.
feel like that's what's happening with a lot of guys. So technically, it is
It's
kind of,
yeah.
to them at least, it is like a threat in a sense.
In a way, it's almost it feels like when someone's religious doctrine gets tested, where it's like, oh well, how do you believe in this and this, or and then you find some inconsistencies in it, and then it just makes them instead of having that adaptability moment of going, oh well, okay, never really thought about this or this and the third. I still believe in what I believe, but let me take this into consideration. It's very much a aggressive, well, duh, like this does not no, like
It's very,
where
it's very dogmatic.
yeah, it's where I guess that's the fault of when you put your masculinity, femininity, or whatever into superficial things. Um, where on a whim, like things that easily change over time, that just ends up being what happens. And I guess it's something that these guys who have their masculinity in that are going to have to get through. Now, with that said, I know this isn't a perfect world. I know even saying that, a lot of these people then are just go to the closest guy that's saying well, whiskey is masculine, and football is masculine, and it's just masculine. And it's like they're just going to go to someone that just continuously reaffirms their beliefs. But it's it then kind of begs the question of those, like, why do they find those superficial things to be a part of some things that are genuinely masculine anyway, like football, for example, where you don't see a lot of women into or football. Like, I don't know about you, I personally am also not into football. I am into other sports. I guess people would say are masculine, like MMA, things like that. And whenever, but to go back into football, whenever the Super Bowl comes on, like recently the Super Bowl just came on, my girl does not give a damn. He's just like, what team are you rooting for? And I'm like, I kind of like this team this year. And it's like, all right, cool. She can tell you who does this, can tell you a position or whatever. So most men are into football,
Well,
or not most men, but are
well,
there'll be more men into football than women. So it's
well,
like, why?
Well, it's funny because the way you, it's so funny to use that example because when it comes to me and my girlfriend, we're the exact opposite. Where I'm someone like she actually like will watch like football games and like sports, and I'm like I could give a fuck about this. Like even as someone who grew up in Boston, like our sports culture was huge, and I had
Yeah,
like even my entire family, not even the men, like the woman too, my mother, my aunt, my cousins, like it's a huge sports town.
huge thing.
And I always felt like the odd one out because I just like never gave a fuck. But then of course, there are cases where then there are things where like she likes One Direction and rom-coms, and I like uh, Led Zeppelin.
Linkin Park and John Wick.
Yeah, it's like it's hard because I'm not someone who says like I think that there are some reasons that men are drawn to certain things and women are drawn to certain things outside of societal conditioning.
Yes.
Like, but the issue, and this is like a conversation I've had a lot with people. My belief is that, and I think based pretty on like just evidence that we've seen in different cultures, is that what happens is like, let's say we have a 10% difference in men and women based solely on biology, in terms of preference and sort of behavior, et cetera, et cetera. Then you take that 10% difference and you put it into a society, and that society exacerbates it into a much larger difference. So, for example, let's say on average, most men, or let's say like biologically, most boys would prefer playing with a truck over a doll, and vice versa for women. Like, okay, there is a difference there, but it's not that significant. However, then when those children grow up in a society starts to reinforce that. The boy goes down the toy aisle, and all he sees is trucks, and the girl goes down the girl aisle, and all she sees is dolls. So all of a sudden, that 10% difference, like that is inherent in men and women. And again, I'm just spitballing. I don't even really know I don't know whether or not there is one, how much it is. I don't know how it works. But
yeah,
what I can say is that society then takes that difference, whatever it is, and then sort of exacerbates it and makes it even larger and grows that rift and kind of forces men and women into very rigid roles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So where I'm guessing where it's like, okay, now the boy will automatically go into the boy aisle at a Kmart, and then the girl will go automatically into the girl aisle. Well, there'll be all the dolls, and it's all pink and all that type of stuff for one, and then you'll see like Beyblades and Hot Wheels and like the other. Like, in terms of that,
it's hard to say like how much of the difference between men and women in our current society is based off of biology, inherent differences, or societal conditioning. And the difficulty is that we really don't know. It's probably a mix of both. Personally, I would put more stake in societal conditioning.
Yeah.
To a large degree. But there are people who either think it's all societal, like there are no inherent differences between men and women at all, which I don't agree with. And then there are people who are like, no, society is totally based on biological drives, and everything in society is totally just as a result of those inherent differences, which I also think is not. I think that doesn't make any sense at all either.
I am of the belief. I remember once again invoking Jordan Peterson's name into it again. There was a video he had a while ago. It'd probably be in one of those watch these libs get smacked down videos, compilations, where he's talking to a woman about kind of like gender and the biases or the something about like egalitarianism. Like when you go into a lot of countries that practice more egalitarianism, that the differences in men and women end up growing than shortening. And I am
Well,
a slight believer in that.
well,
But
the issue. So
mm,
I remember because that was a big proponent. That was a big thing that I used to like also like look to. So
mm,
there's one big issue with that sort of sort of theory that what he's talking about. So for
yeah,
example, let's take in our current society,
mm,
the U.S. is very like quite egalitarian in terms of like social policy, in terms of
yes.
like rights for men and women. Yes, yes. So like yeah, if you look at the data, it's like oh, okay, well the more egalitarian a society, the more the gender difference between men and women they widen. Well, the
Mm,
problem with that is that I think I remember looking into this research. The issue with that is that if you just because a society has certain egalitarian policies doesn't necessarily mean they're reflected in the wider society. So, for example, if we
mm,
look at the USA,
mm,
in larger cities, we see a lot more. We see variance in some areas throughout the country. We see how things are a lot more traditional. You know, men and women
mm,
have more like traditional gender roles, and they adhere to them much more than say in big cities, where like we see a lot. We kind of see those gender roles sort of breaking down to a greater extent. So, for
mm,
example, more egalitarian relationships, a less reliance on traditional gender roles,
mm,
non-traditional relationship structures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the issue there is that it doesn't. While he was using data based on egalitarian policy, I think the issue is that doesn't necessarily mean it reflects in the society in itself. Also, it also kind of falls victim to the time the time after those egalitarian policies have been implemented. So, for
mm,
example, after the Civil Rights Act was passed, it wasn't like racism was like solved the day after
mm,
it was passed. It was like technically, if you took that poll the day after the Civil Rights Act was passed, it's like, hey, we have equal rights for blacks and whites. Yeah, but it's going to take some time for this to like really take effect. Like
yeah.
even in today's society, 50 years later, it's still not really there. We're still
Mm,
struggling with a lot.
mm,
So that's sort of one of the big issues with what he was talking about.
with
But
that poll.
wait, what?
Oh, with the information that he brought up, where
Yeah, I kind because I remember I used to like really like when he said that. I remember that exact interview. I think it was like a Swedish talk show or something, and
yeah,
like yeah, that was like oh yeah, that's a big factor when we're talking about gender differences. However, then I kind of read up into it more, and then I kind of that's when I learned about like yeah, but just because a society has egalitarian policies doesn't necessarily mean those are reflected in the society. That's more cultural. So
mm,
like governments or like federal policy doesn't always match up exactly to a nation's culture. Yeah.
that makes sense. That makes sense. I can ruminate on that a little later, but that's a thinker right there.
Yeah. Well, again, I don't think it's either or. I think it's a mix of both. I think there definitely are inherent differences between men and women. But I think society has kind of warped them to the
Ex-
extent where it's like it's made them way bigger than they would inherently be.
than it should have been.
Yeah, basically.
I guess that can definitely make sense. Where something as superficial as sports or toys or whatever the hell, like that is
Or
going to probably be more like, oh, well, a couple of boys like wrestling toys and a couple of girls like dolls, so let's just do this. Where it's like, okay, maybe like with research we can see if that could be the case.
or even for example like something that people have pointed out to me. It's like, well, girls tend to like dolls more. It's like, yeah, but the issue there is like, do they, or do guys
Mm.
like them just as much? We just call them action figures. And that kind of, I mean, like technically, right? If a dude's playing, because
Yes.
like my cousin used to have a Stone Cold Steve Austin action figure when we were kids, so technically
Uh,
we were playing with dolls. And meanwhile,
Pretty much, yeah.
My sister was playing PlayStation. She was playing Barbie Horse Adventure or something. So
Uh,
is it that boys are drawn innately to video games and girls are drawn innately to dolls? Or is there a level deeper where, well, if the dolls are like Power Rangers, like things that boys
mhm.
are interested in, they'll be more apt to play with the dolls. If the video games are marketed towards women, like girls with stuff they like Barbie or like Princess Polly or whatever, they'll be more apt to play video games. Like when we look at
That
video
is, yeah,
games,
that's a good question.
like yeah, when we look at video games, is it that men inherently are drawn to video games more than women? Or is it that for the last like 30 years, almost all the marketing around
Has
video
been towards
games
men.
has been like, yeah, so what if we like, have they ever, like, what would even like marketing toward to women in video games even look like? I don't even know. It's like, I never even given it thought.
I'm gonna be a dick and I'm gonna say Overwatch.
It's actually, isn't Overwatch a game that like actually has a much more like a equal male female player base?
I think so. I've met in terms, once again, this is all anecdotal. Somebody could come out and be like, "Hey, so actually," but in terms of like when Overwatch was a big thing, I
Mm-hmm.
would see more back, especially I think it was towards my end, my senior year of college, freshman year of high school. I did see a lot more girls who were into gaming play Overwatch than be like, "Oh, I also want to get into Call of Duty" or stuff like that. So I would say probably more so. I would say more so. Yeah, maybe it is more so in the middle, but just as anecdotal, I personally wouldn't know the stats. Maybe Activision Blizzard might have it. I don't know.
Twice.
Um,
This was from 2017, but twice the number of women play Overwatch than any other FPS. That's very
yeah,
interesting.
damn. So I wasn't talking. I thought I was
And
just being goofy and talking shit.
granted, like that might like depending on how often like women played like FPS, like Call of Duty and stuff like that. That's, that might still be a low percentage, but it's very
Uh,
interesting that like, well, why is this one game has draws so much more women? That's actually interesting.
I guess because then to go back onto the whole action figure or doll thing, it's one of those. Uh, Instead of seeing like, oh, the boys like action figures, girls like dolls. To your point of making it a deeper question, it's like, okay, well, how do boy like what when it's how is it marketed? Like in terms of what's the
Mm-hmm.
marketing towards it? Like if for boys is it Power Rangers or for girls is it Barbies? And then with that, when you see whatever the doll or toy is, how do they then play with it? Like for example, like for I remember my female cousins, they did have Barbies and stuff, and they would kind of have like the whole Ken doll situation. And then being the run of the litter, I would then play with them and play with the dolls, but I would be more so like trying to like smash them together, like when I had my John Cena versus Edge toys. So it's
Yeah.
like,
Well, it's the big question is like so the question there would be, when it comes to the difference between male and female preferences in our current society, how much is
mm,
dictated by innate factors like biology, like brain chemistry, and
mm,
how much is dictated by societal conditioning? And the
nature
issue,
versus nurture.
yeah, and the issue is that because we can control for these factors, how do we possibly sparse these out? How do we, in order to do so, we would have to take like a pair of twins and then send one to live in like a mega hyper egalitarian society where there were no societal differences between men and women and see what
Mm,
happens. But we can't really do that because by the time a
no.
kid gets old enough to like kind of like participate in like we can't really like we've done studies on like kids toddlers, like little children, but it's very
Mm,
difficult because once we really have to allow the kids to get old enough to we can kind of like understand their thought processes, like like
mm,
teens, like where they're kind of like shaping their identity. But the
mm,
problem is that by the time a kid's like 13, they've been exposed to so much in society that how do we separate their innate behaviors with societal conditioning?
mm,
Here's a perfect example because this is something that discuss a lot in terms of like the red pill.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's pretty well accepted throughout society that women prefer taller men. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Now, I can see that there is some sort of innate factor there. Like I can see like if based on like evolutionary psychology, I could see a
Mm-hmm.
theory of like, hey, women are attracted to taller men for a biological reason.
Yeah.
However, the question is like, how big of a factor is that? When you consider like, let's take a little girl. She's growing up in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Consider that every single piece of media that she's probably ever seen in her life, or like
Mm-hmm.
99.9% of every single piece of media she's seen, like men and women, couples, etc., 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 has been with the man being taller.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is how much did that influence her preferences later throughout her life? And the hard thing to say is that we don't really know. Like we can't really measure that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've actually heard from a lot of guys say, in America, women tend to be more. Um, they
Just, I
tend to
guess.
put, yeah, they tend to put a bigger emphasis on height. Like, hey, I'm 5'2", but I need a guy who's like over 6 foot. Whereas in other cultures, it's not as much. And it's like, okay, so that sort of speaks to maybe there is some innate factor that women do want taller guys, but it also
Mm-hmm.
seems like society plays a very large factor in reinforcing that or in exacerbating that innate factor. And
Mm-hmm.
in order to try to figure out how big of a role that innate factor plays, we have to control for society. But how can we possibly do that with like grown adult women?
I, that's a question that I cannot answer. Someone who
Yeah.
only did 2 years of community college, I cannot do that. That seems more of a that. Yeah. And as a tall man, do I even want to figure that out and try and blow the lead for
not
tall
ask
men everywhere?
not ask questions.
Exactly. It's
Um,
like just let the tall men reign. But yeah, I that is a fair point. Of there are like as a biology I can't even say it, as a biofactor, women liking taller guys, how much is that based on nature versus nurture, based on kind of societal like exacerbations of the situation? um Damn, that's a good point.
yeah,
That
and
is a good point.
it's hard because the two schools of, or I shouldn't say the two schools of thought, but the two biggest things I see are the most popular is that, well, no, it's all society. The only reason women like taller men is because society tells them, and I'm like, I don't
Very.
know if that's entirely
And so
true. And
yeah.
but then I also hear from like like red pill dudes. It's like, well, that's all evolutionary psychology, and it's all based on biological determinism. And I'm like,
Mhm.
I don't know. It also doesn't really factor in that men on average are 6 inches taller than women on
Mhm.
average throughout the world. So that kind of it's less of a matter of like, are women actually attracted to taller men, or is it that the pool that they're picking from on average is always going to be
Is
much taller than
usually
them?
tough.
Yeah.
But then even that, if that would be the case, then it would still like let's say if we were asking that question and there would be I would imagine there would still be a high influx of couples where a woman then picks a short man if it isn't what you would call where we are asking the question of do women truly like their man to be taller, the short men in society, especially in places like I guess the West, where it is more of a different melting pot and there is more I guess height disparity or height sizes, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
where shorter men would still be picked more than the taller man, or at least that's where my brain goes. Where and then even to that question of then why do women, especially and once again in the West, do go for the taller man, like not even reasonably tall? Where, for example, my girl is she's like 5'8", I would say, and I'm like 6'2". So it's I guess still a big height difference, but not too much. But like you said, there are girls that I've met who are around damn near midget size who are like, well, I would like a guy to be like 5'11", 6 foot, and you're like, you
Yeah,
don't. That doesn't
there's
even make sense.
there's this sort of like I've met women who said like if a woman's like 5'9", it's like, hey, how tall does a guy have to be? It's like, well, he has to be taller than me, probably like 6 foot.
Mm,
And then I'll ask a girl
yeah.
who's like 5'3", how tall does a guy have to be? It's like, taller than me, 6 foot. And so in that
Yeah.
case, it's not just that, oh, okay, women tend to prefer men who are taller. There seems to be
Mm,
like this weird fetishization of like guys between like 6 foot and 6'3". And it's like,
yes.
okay, but that's a little strange because it you would think it would fluctuate with a female's height. Like, so for example, is if a woman is 6 foot tall, is she more attracted to a guy who's 6'6" and a guy who's 6'2"? I don't really
Mm,
know. Something else to note, and I always thought
it's gonna
this
be a
was
giant
interesting.
ass family.
Yeah, right. Something also interesting note, and I've kind of thought about this a lot too, is that so for example, like let's say a woman is like 5'9" and she meets a guy who's 5'8", 5'9", roughly her same height, maybe a little shorter.
Mm,
Now the question is, now let's say a woman doesn't want to date him because he is shorter. Now is that because there is some like biological innate drive in her, like from a strictly sexual, you know, evolutionary psychology standpoint, that she is
mm,
just not attracted to this guy who is an inch shorter than her?
mm,
Or from like a sexual, like a romantic standpoint, she doesn't really care, but she is self-conscious to like she's like sort of like subconsciously conscious or
what
subconsciously
will
self-conscious of how
what will other
people will
people think of
exactly, and
where
how do you
they
sort
see
of
this guy?
and how do you sort of or like for example, like if we even like in our current society, um interracial couples, while they're
Mm,
on the rise, for the most part, people sort of, you know, I think on average
still stick with their own.
stick with their own race. Now, is that I'm sure there might be a somewhat of a biological component to that. Maybe it's sort of like an experience thing. Hey, we probably have comparable experiences.
Mm,
However, I wonder, like, so for example, as a white man, I wonder if there's ever been a case where I've met like a black girl or an Asian girl,
mm,
and maybe there was something, even if I was sexually attracted to her, was there something in my head considering it's like, oh, how would society view us as an interracial couple? Because that's still in many spheres of society that's still looked at as sort of, unfortunately, it's still sort of looked at as taboo or sort of what's sort of looking for undesirable.
I
Um,
get that makes sense because it's I'm in a funny enough I'm in an interracial relationship right now, and it is very it's as someone who because I grew up in New York and I grew up in like the heart of the five boroughs, so I've been used to having multiple people around me, even to the point where I have the philosophy of whatchamacall, like why would God put so many people on this planet just for me to kind of stick to one group? If I marry a black woman, so be it. But if not, then it's just something that happens, you know what I mean?
yeah, like
And a lot of people,
my
yeah,
girlfriend, like
good.
I've dated all races. My girlfriend's Filipino. It's
Hmm.
not, but it's not because that's the hard thing. It's like consciously I've never been one to like care about that. Like I was never like
Hmm.
my family wouldn't care if I brought home a black girl, Asian girl, whatever.
Hmm.
But I wonder like subconsciously, I like what were there factors that were influencing my like like I don't like to say that, but like who the chicks I found attractive,
Attractive.
was there something more subconscious going on that I wasn't even aware of? And it kind of
That
fucks you up to think about it.
it seems like we're two people who just continuously ask too many goddamn questions. Where it's like, oh damn, oh my life's about to change for this one question. But with that, like a lot of people who are say immigrants or families or not families, descendants of immigrants, it is more so of a you ask them a lot of the times. Like I grew up with a lot of African friends, and it was very much it was to the point where a lot of them wouldn't even they would specifically try and go after more African, like in terms of culture, not even just black, because then even like for a lot of families, African women can't really bring a Black American man or vice versa home because of kind of the cultural implications of that. Of like, hey, why'd
Exactly.
you trying to date this hood guy and all that type of shit. Where
Is it like a like a strictly like biological thing where you're like actually like more sexually attracted to someone of your own race, or is it more of like an emotional thing where, hey, as a Black American, I kind of make the presumption that another Black American will have a they'll have more comparable experiences to me in general. Probably like not like entirely, but probably in
but just
general.
a lot of the same. Like
Exactly.
where when you ask them, and because I have, because especially as someone who's always, and not like I'm always trying to go for the interracial, but someone who's ended up in more interracial relationships, a lot of people then ask me, and then I ask them, and you ask, they a lot of their answers are from ranges of, well, like you just said, of we have similar experiences, or in terms of like a lot of black woke terms, we share the same struggle to, oh, I want my children to look like me. Like,
Yeah.
or kind of the where it's more the answer that's more acceptable for POC people, I guess, and not acceptable for a lot of white people, where it's I want my I want to preserve my culture. I want to preserve my traditions and stuff like that. So I would say it's more so emotionally like a nurture thing. Maybe I feel like nature wise, you ask a lot of these people where there's no family involved, there's the world doesn't give a shit. They kind of go of, oh, I'll date whoever I like, whoever. But then you put culture into it for people who are intensely into that or intensely into tradition, and it is more of a like, well, I can't bring so and so home. I hear a lot of stories, or I've heard a lot of stories of older black men dating interracially, where one had dated like a white Jewish person, and not even really date, more just messed around with. And he wanted to make the relationship more serious, but she was like, "I can't. I'm Jewish. I have to marry a Jewish man. I can't bring you back home." So it's very much. I would assume it's very much more emotional. But in
Yeah.
terms of asking all these questions, it's like,
But
God
and
damn it.
then and just to ask like and then to like we'll get back to topic at hand, but like to ask an even like more uh in the thick question, how much of that emotional reaction is based off of like inherent biological factors? Because like our emotions and biology, they kind of go hand in hand, right?
Yes.
So yeah, so how much of that, like you could even say, like going back to um like, hey, if a girl doesn't want to date a shorter guy because people in society might make them look weird. That could,
Uh-huh.
you could argue, be a somewhat of a biological factor in the sense of like the
Ostracized.
yeah, like you don't want to not fit in, or you don't want to be ostracized, and trying to sparse these things out between what is like what are your preferences based on like biologically, societally? Can you even tell the difference sometimes? How do they intermix? Yeah, that's kind of like why when it comes to like racial or even like height or weight preferences when it comes to dating,
Mm,
sometimes I think the best solution is to just not ask questions. I'm kind of with you
yeah.
where it's like whenever that conversation comes up about like racial dating preferences, I'm like it's a very complicated discussion. Maybe just fuck whoever you want to fuck. Like,
Exactly. It's like, fuck it. Are you happy now? Like that's the question you should ask. Are you happy now?
yeah, like if
But I think nope. No, I'm thinking. Are you happy? Yeah. All right. Cool. And there you
like
go.
maybe like there are some cases like if you're a white guy and you only find Asian chicks attractive, maybe that's something. Or if you're like a white chick and you only like fucking black guys, like
Yeah.
maybe these are things that you might want to examine. But in general, if you're like a white guy and you find that you have maybe like a slight preference for like Latina chicks,
Uh-huh.
I like don't think too much about it. Just live your
Yeah.
life.
That's a very fair point. Where I have met a good amount of people who, um, have something like that. Where especially during high school, for some reason, it was a phase for a lot of my sophomore year for a lot of my friends to not try and date someone who was in their race. Why, I do not know. It was very weird at the time. But you would ask them, and it was very much like for example, I had a white friend. Um, he was very much. I think he was Polish, if I'm not mistaken. He identified with that culture heavily, and he was like, "Oh, I don't like trying to date white chicks. I'm trying to go for mainly like either black or Latina." And then I asked him, I was like, "Why?" And then it was very teenager answer. It was very like, "Well, what have you ever dated a white chick? They're annoying." Ah. And it's like, eh,
That
it's
gets
very much.
that gets weird too.
It's
Like that's
weird.
like the whole like I think that was like a whole fresh and fit controversy where
Yeah,
they were making very deterministic discussions about like how we don't date black women, and it's like, why not? And it's like, well, because they act like this, and it's like,
it's
you want
very
to be
much
careful there.
yeah, it's a toxic conversation. As someone who has dabbled in that conversation or who has been forced to, because in the black community, it is very much like especially as a black man, if you date, you get away with dating like a Latina because a lot of black people are like, Latino people are just black people who can swim. It's a very kind of like funny, semi-racist, like, okay, cool, whatever, as
Yeah,
long as I don't get yelled at. But you try and date a white woman, and especially as a black man, or even to a lot of black women out there who date white men, it's very much like a how dare you date the oppressor type of situation. So you ask those questions for like the fresh and fit guys, where it's like, oh, we don't like date black women because they're loud or because they're angry and all that type of stuff. Where for me, it's a part like and even like black women who have the same idea, just vice versa, obviously, where part of me gives it up to them because as someone who's in the culture, I kind of understand a lot of the issues, so to say, of of people in the culture. But then it's also begs the question of, well, do you attract these types of people? Because I know a lot of black men and women who aren't loud or who aren't ghetto or who aren't these sorts of negative stereotypes. So is it a you are just attracting these people, or maybe it's your neighborhood or stuff like that? It's a very weird
the
conversation that could get into very you're a self-hating type person territory, but I try and let people live and let live, but
the funny part about that is that especially with like fresh and fit, when like they're like every episode is like women are like this, women are vapid and they're whores and they
yeah,
only like money, and it's like
it's very weird. Yeah.
I'm not denying that there are women like that. However,
Uh-huh.
like if like this is the example I use to like when guys kind of get in that mindset of like all women are like this.
Mm,
Have if a chick came up to you and was like, "Hey, my ex was an asshole," you would be like, "Oh,
mm,
okay, yeah, you like some guys are assholes. That happens." But if a chick came
yes.
up to you and said, "Hey, my last 7 exes were all assholes," okay, so one, either you're lying, either you have no self awareness and you're actually the
Hmm.
asshole, or two, you have a thing for assholes.
Exactly.
Like
Where
one chick, it's one thing, but if like, and so I turn that around for the guys. It's like if every
mm,
chick you date is like really vapid and like rude and mean and like screws you over,
mm,
like maybe like once or twice, that's like maybe that's just a coincidence. But like if it
it,
happens like 5 or 10 times, like
then
that
it's
sounds
like,
like a
what
you
the hell?
problem.
Exactly. Or for the fresh and fit to try and get more so back into the masculinity thing, but to also make fun of them a little bit because I find them very funny. Where a lot of men fall into their kind of rhetoric where they use a lot of half truths and things like that. Where it's like you said, a lot of it is like, oh, women are whores and what you call they just want money, or they're very what's the term where it's basically just women are attracted into what they can get from men. Hypergamy, I think.
Well,
Um,
hypergamy is more
somehow,
like the theory that like women are like biologically determined to like date higher into a social class. The
yeah,
problem there is that, or at least like the big issue with the theory is that, well, or that women are attracted to status. The
yeah. There you
issue,
go.
yeah, the issue there is that, well, one, I don't really think that's necessarily a female thing. I think that's mostly just it really depends on what you value in a person. So like for
Uh,
guys, if a guy could, hey, do you have a, if you could choose between a woman who's like on the look scale like a 6 out of 10 and a woman who's on a 9 out of 10, most
uh,
guys would go for the 9 out of 10. Like of course they would. Like that
yes,
just makes sense.
yes.
But also the issue that when we're talking about status, that's a very complicated thing. So like for example, a lot
Mm,
of people like will ask like, hey, how come all these like hot ass chicks are dating Pete Davidson? Like this like scrawny, like lanky, like goofy looking dude. Like shouldn't
Side
they
note,
be
real
after
quick.
like Chad? And it's like, well, it's a lot like when we're talking about like status, that's a very complicated term. Like if we're like depends on culture, age, it depends on a lot of different factors. So when they just say, well, status is money and six pack. And well, yeah, if you flaunt your money and you flaunt a six pack, you're going to get superficial women. Like that just
Yes.
makes sense. And then you complain that all the women you meet are gold diggers. Like, what the fuck, dude?
Yes. It is that. That's what I was gonna say about that whole Miami thing of a lot of these. They're like, "Oh, women are whores." This sound at third, and it's like, okay, cool. What to show that we're gonna bring a lot of women onto this podcast, and then you go, "Oh, so you're in Florida, Miami, Florida, and a lot of the women that you pick up are just coming out of clubs and stuff like that, and they're just really trying to. It's a part of that Miami culture to do that a lot of the times. Of course, that's what it's like me trying to be like, oh, black people aren't ghetto, and all the black people that I get to try, or black people are ghetto, and then all the black people that I get are from like Marcy Projects or some shit. Like it's like, okay, what?
Yeah, is it
And
more?
then the
Is
whole
it a racial thing, or is it more of like a cultural, like the pool that you're choosing from?
exactly, and
Like
then
I'm
even with
from,
the whole yeah,
like the kind of like to sort of like bring it. We can bring it back in a second. Sorry, this is really interesting though.
mm-hmm,
I'm from Boston, and like I was saying,
mm-hmm,
a lot of Boston women, or like like Quincy and like South Boston, they have the
mm-hmm,
reputation for kind of being very sort of the same stereotype that you would hear from like Latina or black women, kind of like very loud mouth, obnoxious, loud, like the kind of like negative stereotypes. You get that
yeah,
a lot from, or like
from
Jersey
Boston,
girls, yeah.
yeah,
And so in that case, okay, so it's not really a racial thing; it's more of a cultural thing. Income
mm-hmm,
also plays into it a lot. So yeah,
mm-hmm,
so then when you hear, and like even that, like like oh Boston girls or Jersey girls, like even that is reductive because it depends on
yeah,
well, I mean like
where?
do you mean a girl from Quincy or do you mean a girl from like who goes to like Harvard or like MIT?
Yeah,
So it's that's like even that is reductive. But then when you simplify it to just like oh white girls are like this, it's like or black girls are like this. It's like you're not even. That's a very very bad
it's a
path to
vast
go down.
pool where this is complete bad faith automatically. Or back into the hypergamy thing of what you brought up, a lot of to have a lot of gotchas, a lot of those types of people will be like you said, like, oh, do you want for a man, do you want a woman that's kind of like a 6 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10? Of course, people are going to say a 9 out of 10. And then for women, it's going to be, do you want a man like, would you like a man that's working a 9 to 5, or would you like a man that is a millionaire who has really big penis, all that type of stuff. Of course, when you put that narrative on there with none of the negatives, when you automatically because automatically in your head, for a man, when you think 6 out of 6, a woman who's a 6 on a scale, like, oh, okay, fine. But then you go to a 9, automatically in your head, that woman who's become a 6 is average or is a negative now. And it's like, oh, of course, you're going to want someone who is in a better field or treats themselves better or has more things to offer, but you don't put any of the negatives in there as well. So you're not asking
It
like the real question, if that
a
makes
good
sense.
a good way to turn that question on its head is to ask a woman, "Hey, would you rather a man who is like a 6 out of 10 on the look scale who makes
Mm-hmm.
$500,000 a year, or a man
Mm-hmm.
who's a 9 out of 10 on the look scale but makes $50,000 a year?"
Mm-hmm.
Well, how do you even like that? That's only like the reason I bring that up is you're kind of like, okay, well now I don't really know because like it depends on what you value. Now consider that like when people are actually like because like attraction really isn't a choice. So when you're
Mm-hmm.
choosing people who you want to be your partner, there are like there are dozens, if not hundreds, of little factors that are playing into that you might not even realize. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of those guys think that like choosing a girlfriend or choosing who you're attracted to is like a math equation, and it's like
Yeah.
that is not how that works at all. Like they're
No.
like you'll find yourself attracted to people for like little tiny things that you don't even realize. And then you'll ask
Mm-hmm.
yourself, why am I attracted to this person? And you're like, I don't know, but just go with it,
Yeah.
man.
Exactly. Where it's like it's a lot of those dudes who see it as kind of like a math game. It's very weird. Like I've seldom hung around those types of people, and especially during my like when I was like 18, 19, and it's very how they go about in terms of trying to flirt with women or even talking to women or anything like that. It's a very weird experience that I would prefer to block off to the far far parts of my brain.
Yeah. Funny
But
question too.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know. Sorry, we'll bring it back. My bad. We kind of went off tangent. But funny to think about it is I actually wondered about this with a lot of guys in the pickup artist community. There were a lot of guys who were obsessed with like, hey, here's how to get like 9 and 10s. And at some point, I started to realize, hang on, I feel like a lot of these guys just want to sleep with hot women. Like obviously, like guys want to get laid, like of course. But I feel
Yes.
like sometimes the reason they want girlfriends who are hot is more of a status symbol. Like they kind of want
Yes.
to. Part of the reason they're like drawn to this girl is because they want other people to see that they can get a girl that hot, even if she's a
Yes.
total bitch. Like and like I've heard like horror stories of guys who are like they get a really hot girlfriend and she's like super boring and like they have no chemistry and like she's really mean, but they'll still date her because she's hot. And it's like,
Yes.
why are you doing this? And I
It
wonder in part if it's because there's a certain status, like, oh well, I have a hot girlfriend, so that means I'm a man or I'm more manly than other guys.
in the black community, I don't know about kind of for anybody else, but for our barbershops, there's kind of a joke of like when a teenager gets his first girlfriend, you kind of bring her there to see like kind of like what your like barber says of kind of like if she's hot, then you kind of get like a dap up from your barber like, hey man, you was able to get that. Or if she's like ugly, and it's kind of like a, well, I hope at least you're happy. And where it's like,
Yeah.
but it's like that, like I feel like it is that status symbol because especially back then when I was into that, trying to figure out like my place of how to talk to women and how to do all of that, it was very much like a lot of these pickup guys were very much, the seedy ones at least were very much like, hey, this, like you said, this is how you pick up an 8, this is how you pick up a 9, and you gotta be mean to her and all this like kind of like schoolyard shit. um and then when you find your own way and you are successful in having what you would call a 8 or a 9 in terms of like superficially, and you do kind of have that boring conversation, it's, or not boring conversation, a boring personality or just a personality that doesn't match up with yours, but you're just doing it for the clout of, well, my girl is my girl, like she's hot, like a lot of these dudes end up finding themselves in that kind of like you want a trophy wife kind of
Mm-hmm.
mentality, and it's very sad as someone who was in it for a little bit. It's very sad to like especially in high school, I saw a lot of my friends get girls that just weren't interesting whatsoever, and just in, I guess, in my kind of idea, and even for them because they would complain about them all the time, and then you would kind of ask $1 million question of, so why did you want to like date her? Like, what's up? And then they're like,
What's your
start
favorite
stuttering.
movie? I don't know.
And it's like, I don't know. When's her birthday? Damn, that's a
Uh,
great question. It's like,
do you
what?
they're
What?
like, do you think she has a birthday like me? I'm like, oh my god.
It's
Um,
like, what?
funny, we can actually use this as a perfect excuse to wrap back around because I actually think that is in part ties back into our what we're talking about how guys they're trying to latch on to things that will allow them to feel like a man. Like
Yes.
nowadays the concept of masculinity is changing so much with especially in the like with like I mean not even in just in terms of you know men wearing like more traditionally feminine clothing, women wearing more
Mhm.
traditionally manly clothing. Um, but then you get into the like homosexuality. You have transgender people, non-binary people, and so a lot
Uh-huh.
of guys who are trying to figure out their identity as a man, all of a
Mm.
sudden, all these things are being upended and like being like they're grabbing from the roots and ripping them out. And so you have
Mhm.
all these young guys and they're trying to figure out how do I feel like a man in this society when what
Mhm.
is considered quote unquote masculine is changing or not really changing, but like if I ask 5 different people, I'll get 10 different answers.
Yeah.
And the pickup artist community, I think actually, or even like Fresh and Fit, like all these like Red Pill guys, all the it all factors in because these are guys telling them, hey, this is how to be a man. This is what you have to do. And you'll have guys who are like so desperate to feel that like or so desperate to attain that sense of masculinity. They'll
Uh-huh.
do things that like kind of how you mentioned, like they'll do things that make them miserable. They'll date women that make them miserable.
Mhm.
They'll 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 diet down to like 5% body fat to the point where like their dick doesn't
Yikes.
work and they're like oh, seriously, like that's the big irony. Like when I was in the bodybuilding phase, is guys were like, hey, if I get like super ripped, so I'll be able to fuck so many chicks. It's like, do you know what happens when like you get like sub 10% body fat? A
Yeah.
lot of like not fun stuff happens.
Hey, I look like Goku, but I can't, I can't get it up anymore. Like,
Yeah,
fuck.
it kind of defeats the purpose, dude.
Yeah, like fuck. My girl was in the fitness community, and I'm just only bringing this up to say she as someone she had her own gym at one point, and she said one of the hardest parts about like trying to legitimately be in fitness and trying to legitimately help people is that people want the sexy answer. People want the, oh, you just need this, or you just need to do this, or you just need to go on this diet, or you just need to do this amount of reps. Like they want the sexy answer because and I hope she's gonna end up watching this, which we'll call, so maybe I hope I don't butcher it. But she says that people want the sexy answer because then it ends up going back on them of why then if the answer isn't this, then I haven't been able to do it this whole time or achieve this because of myself. I think now to translate that into back into this, I think for a lot of people, fresh and fit give the sexy, easy answer, in my opinion. They give the easy, oh, for masculinity or to be a dude or be a man, you need to do this, 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 this. It's like
You need to have
literally
slept with 50 women. You need to make six figures. You need to have
50.
have a 12 pack or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. Like just a whole bunch of stuff where I guess maybe it's attainable to not attainable, where it's just a lot of it is a lot of it ranges from like silly to okay, this can be reasonable. It just needs to be done in a healthier energy, in my opinion, in terms of like money wise, especially. But they give that sexy answer where
Mm-hmm.
for you ask any kind of like other, if you ask a well, what's the term? I've been using it for several weeks now. Socially calibrated. I feel like you use the term or something like
Mm-hmm.
that, and I've just fucking coined it now. Or fucking not coined it, but just use it now. But if you ask
I've
any
used
like,
it. It's hard because that's such a even I kind of hate using that term sometimes because it's such.
uh,
I even admit that it's like it's super vague because like so
yeah,
for example if like how do you know if a girl likes you? It's like I don't know, man. Like do you want me to tell you like the exact equation, like the exact signs? Like it just some like, and I hate to say this to some guys because like it doesn't help them, but it's just like you know if you know, and like and that, like guys hate that because they're like, wow, thanks asshole, you helped me, you did not help me at all, and it's like I know,
I
I'm
would have
sorry,
fucking
but
hated you at like 13.
but
Oh, as a
it's
man, I can like understand.
oh
He's not
god,
wrong.
but it's so true because I tell guys like when they're like, how do you talk to women? And it's like, there's no
No,
way to talk to women. You just have
you
to
just
talk
do it.
to a lot of women, and you'll just kind of get you'll just kind of figure it out. It's like
Yeah.
playing. It not the best metaphor, but kind of like muscle memory in a sense, where you just keep
Hmm.
doing it, and your brain will eventually adapt. It sucks. It's a very hard process because you're gonna be awkward. You're probably gonna get rejected a lot. You're gonna feel like an
Hmm.
idiot. You're gonna feel like insecure, but that's just part of the process. And it
I
sucks to
see it
tell
as
guys
like
that,
doing,
but
yeah. I see it as like doing comedy. Like when people start out, it's like you're gonna
perfect
bomb, you're gonna
example.
eat shit for like fucking damn near years.
That's literally what
Hopefully not that long. But
like stand-up comics say. It's like you will bomb.
yeah,
You will
you
bomb, and that
will
is a very important part of the process.
you will eat literal shit, but it's the whole process of that muscle memory of like, okay, now I've ate, it's getting rid of that, like going past that phase of eating shit, and now like, okay, how do I have fun with this? How do I make this my own? And then kind of going along that process. But in terms of to go back into it, and so the easy answer, if people go to Fresh and Fit, they get the easy answer. But you ask any kind of like semi well adjusted, I'll use that term, adults or men of like, how do I talk to women or how do I do this? Like you said, it'll be like, well, you just do it. And then a lot of boys or God forbid men are like, well, fuck, that doesn't help me out. But when you think about it, it does because it tells you you have to figure it out. Like it's like the, I guess, I can't hold your hand. Like a lot of people want you to hold their hand, and for teenagers or boys, like you have kids, like I have my stepson. I know, like in about probably 2 to 3 years, we'll have to go through this. Well, he'll go have experiences with girls, and he'll be like, "Hey, how do I do this?" And I'm gonna be like, "Yeah, figure it the fuck out. You talk
Yeah.
to him. You don't act creepy.
It's
What
kind
you
of
call
like,
shower."
yeah, a good way to put it is like, as like, kind of like a strange metaphor, but like, you throw them into the deep end of the pool, but then you
Mhm.
help them out if they're struggling. It's kind
Exactly.
of a weird, like, let them know that, like, hey, I'm gonna throw you into the deep end of the pool, but if you need help, just let me know and I'll be there. But I'm not gonna like put like floaties on you or like carry
Floaties
you
on
through the
you,
water. It's a weird
and
metaphor, but
that's
I think it kind of makes sense.
it's apt as hell. It's a lot, and it's scary, especially using that metaphor because there's the aspect of drowning. It's the
Mm-hmm.
aspect of, especially talking to women in terms of like this masculinity conversation. It's looking like a fool, potentially being creepy, potentially going too far, or even fuck it, the rejection before you even say hi or before you get past hi. It's that like the fear, but in terms of that of teaching boys to go past that, or I don't know, what you call being more comfortable within themselves, learning how to read the room, and that you will have to do this multiple times, like multiple times, just like anything. But also like the energy of doing it. Like, are you doing it just to get chicks? Are you doing it because there's a girl in your class that you like? Like, it's a whole bunch of different things, but the answer is always going to be just Nike, motherfucker, just do it. Just
Yeah,
do it.
it's
And
and it makes sense like the way you put it. You put it perfectly in the sense that like I understand why, and like I said this before, like with like whether it's like Red Pill or like guys like Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, like any sort of like male guru, whatever. The reason that they're so attractive to young men is because, like, yeah. So if a young guy came out to me and said, "How do I be a man? Like, how do I feel? How do I get a sense of masculinity?" What I would tell that kid is, well, that's going to be a very long, arduous process. You're going to have to do a lot of soul searching. You're going to have to do a lot of different things and find out
mm,
what makes you happy. It's going to be a lot of struggling, a lot of confusion, but eventually
mm,
you'll get to a point where you start to sort of slowly build a base of who you are as an individual, and slowly that
mm,
self assurance will come. But it's probably going to take several years of struggling and confusion. And he's
yes.
like, "Wow, that sounds like it fucking sucks." But then you're right. Then he goes to a guy like, Fresh and Fit or like some masculine guru, and they're like, "How do I be a man?" And it's like, well, you have to do 800 push-ups a week, or like, you have to like bench press 300 pounds. You have to know how to hunt. You have to, lift weights. You have to like whiskey and football, and
Mhm.
bang X amount
And
of
then there
women.
you go.
And
And
I
it's
understand that as sort of simplistic as that is, I can see how comforting it is for a lot of guys because they're like, finally, someone's given me, even if it's
an
like,
answer.
even if it's like a bad path, at least someone's given me some direction.
And I would ask how, and I think that's a way that we have not demonized masculinity, but we have actually cheapened masculinity or even femininity for women. I don't know exactly how they go through it, but how we cheapen at least masculinity of we've given our boys the shitty answer. And at least it's an answer, or we've allowed them to go through this path of where you think it's going to be the easier road, but what you call it leads you with nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Where I feel like with that, we've to kind of go into what I was kind of first talking about of like, especially being black and being in the black community, of there's a lot of boys who are really fucking just struggling to try and learn how to become men. Where funny that real quick, me and my girl, we watch YouTube damn near religiously at this point. It's damn near our cable. And one of the funny things about it is that we get a lot of commercials for rap. I don't know if you do, but or I don't know if it's just the algorithm for me, but a lot of rap is a lot of guns and which or like not a lot of rap. Like I'm not trying to sound like a Carlton here, but more of like a lot of hood rap that I get in terms of my the commercials. A lot of guns, it's a lot of booty shaking, it's a lot of like it's a lot of goofy ass things. And you realize that a lot of these dudes in these videos are younger than me. And you sit there and you go, you then look up a lot of these guys like their Wikipedias or their interviews, and you realize that a lot of these guys have like fucking five, six, seven kids, and I go through a lot of charges and stuff like that. And then you're like, well, these boys are trying to find masculinity in a place where there is legitimately no one to teach them. And like one of the things I was going
and
to say before
and a
was
society
real
that's
quick.
just in generally hostile to them for the most part.
Exactly. Exactly. And with that, like from the womb, they get a lot of it from their mothers of like this demonization of them being a man because of that hatred that they've downloaded or have been given to by their mothers and or other uh, caregivers. Where then it's like, well, the first idea of a man, your father, is demonized. It's like he's a piece of shit. He's this, that, and the third. Okay, I don't want to be him, but who am I? And then you don't get a lot of help. You then go around like other, you go around a lot of brother figures as you get older, where a lot of kids that you think are cool, and then you end up falling into a whole bunch of shit, where then you go into that form of toxic masculinity. And I feel like that's a way where we've allowed it to be demonized, I guess, or allowed like the, I guess, once again, the toxic masculinity term of we have we're destroying we're this is the negative form of masculinity, boys trying to be men, and that's not working, if that makes sense. Or you get the other side of it where like where a lot of other men will see it, and it'll like, once again, to keep it in the black community, there's this kind of like growth of this community of black boys wearing like girly clothing or flowers in their hair and stuff like that. Like a lot of stuff, like I think James Smith or Tyler the Creator usually like kind of shows this a lot more. And then boys then see that, and then they're like, hell nah, nah.
Yeah.
But it's
Well,
that
it's
like what
so yeah, like that right there. It's like these guys, like Jaden Smith, like doing this stuff. They aren't threatening. They aren't really like demonizing masculinity. They're just kind of doing their
no,
own thing. But
nah,
the other men who are sort of like still trying to figure out their path, they're kind of grasping on to anything they can, their own view of masculinity. And then when someone comes along, this is sort of why, like in the Reject Modernity video, I didn't really
mm-hmm.
understand why a lot of these guys were like, why, like, so for example, why is like homosexuality correlated with like being like non-masculine? It's sort of it doesn't really make any sense, right? Because like
Mm.
what does one sexuality have to do with whether or not they're masculine? And
One,
I think part of the reason is that is because so much of our culture is like they're like that's sort of like emphasized the fact that like, hey, to be a man you have to be successful with women, you have to be attractive to women. um
mm,
so many men then view any guy whose appearance is not attractive to women, or doesn't appear to be based on their like sort of narrow view of what women find attractive, that is not
mm,
masculine because women don't find it attractive, which is ironic
yes.
because going back to our original point, the fact that so many guys define what's masculine based off what women like kind of sounds a
Mm,
little, that doesn't really sound very masculine to me. And
yes.
I hear that from a lot of guys. They're like, "Well, women like this." I'm like, "What? Who cares what women think? Why? Like, why do you care so much what women think?"
I think it is a you do need the other gender to an extent of kind of things that I guess where it kind of goes back to the question of like what are things that we gravitate towards, whether it be through our nature or through being nurtured of what do women find attractive in in a man, in a straight heterosexual man. But to go back into, because originally you had said something about like the homophobia that like it comes in from a lot of these what did you call it, reject modernity, embrace traditional masculinity situations,
or
where a
even
lot of
sort
it
of,
I
or even sort of just in generally like, and I don't mean to say that like everyone in the manosphere is a homophobe, but
no.
what I mean is that they sometimes will view behaviors that are sort of associated with either femininity or like homosexuality, certain behaviors I had a lot of guys like give me like make fun of me because of my voice is like lispy, for example, or stuff like that. Like, so it's not really like they don't. It's kind of like the people who say I don't hate gay people. I just don't want to see it, or like just don't shove it down my throat. Where it's like they're not
Yeah,
really that these people don't
they're not
actually
hateful.
dislike gay people. They just have a distaste for certain behaviors that are. It's kind of like saying like as a black man, I'm sure you've heard like I have nothing against like black people, but like when they act all ghetto, and it's like, that's like, well, no, it's not racist
Yeah.
because I like Obama, and it's like,
Uh,
but okay.
yeah, I've definitely heard that a good couple of times, especially what's called in my teenage years. But I feel like in terms of the, I guess, homophobia light, I guess, like where I'm not trying to
That's a good way
demonize
to put
anybody.
it.
There we go. Where I'm not, yeah, I like, especially I've been down this path myself. I'm not trying to demonize anybody. I'm not trying to say there's, you know, gays look out, but I think for the reason why, or part of the reason why, as someone who is very honest or tries to look for honest conversations, a lot of these people, when I was growing up, and any sort of male figure from the hood that I could try and look up to, a lot of them, when you get them like behind closed doors, have a experience of sexual trauma, of sexual abuse,
Hmm.
and a lot of that case, you'll ask them. A lot of it is, I didn't feel like a man, like obviously with it, whether that happened to them as a child, or I've had one person where they went to prison and then they were assaulted, and it was very much, now I have to look like they're put in that role of being violated, and they see it inherently as it being feminine, like their masculinity is being taken away from them.
Hmm.
Now, personally, I've only done, once again, 2 years of college, and I did like one psychology class. So I'm not even going to sit here and pretend like I can go down the rabbit hole of, well, for men, why do we do that? Why do we automatically think in terms of sex when someone is, I guess, like the whole giver and the whole taker?
Hmm.
Why, in terms of the giving, or not giving, the taking, would we automatically see that necessarily as feminine? I mean, maybe, I guess, in terms of biologically, obviously, for obvious reasons of like the taker usually is feminine in terms of how things work. Try not to get demonetized here, but um, what
That's
you
why
may
I made
call,
the
I
second channel so we can have more open
can't.
conversations, just in case
Appreciate it.
any
Well,
sponsors
that's
that way
smart thinking
sponsors
right there.
don't like. Hey, I liked your Last of Us 2 review. It's like, oh, you should check out this chat we had about like the intersection of like race and masculinity. They're like, yeah, you know what? Never mind. We're not going to work with you.
Brought to you by Better Health or Manscaped. But so I can't. I have tried to wrestle with it as a victim of sexual assault myself. Of that feeling of, why at times did I feel like this? I don't know. I'm not smart enough at this stage to even go down the process right now, but that is a thing that's there. So I think in terms of homosexuality, people, like, I can at least talk partially for those types of men who are sexual assault survivors, who see that and they're faced with like, oh well, that's feminine, like, or even in terms of a lot of that whole modernity thing of men acting more quote unquote feminine, kind of in and of itself is like, well, they're acting like girls, they're acting like how my mother or my sister would, so that's not masculine.
and yet
um
those and the fact but the factors they're going off of are more like superficial. Like, so for example,
exactly.
like my like my girlfriend has she has a major crush on Harry Styles, and
Hmm.
here's a guy who, he's on stage wearing dresses,
Androgyny.
and yet, and like same thing as like with like Prince or like all the male stars throughout the 80s,
David
these are
Bowie,
men
Michael
who
Jackson.
like any woman would like jump into bed with. So it's kind of
Hmm.
strange that the like the you'll see Harry Styles, who's like married to like Olivia Wilde, or who's
Hmm.
like in front of screaming people, he's owning it, he's confident, he has this self assuredness, and yet people will just they'll ignore all that. They'll ignore the confidence, they'll ignore the self assuredness, the creativity, the courage. They'll ignore all that, and they'll just like, oh well, he's wearing a dress, so he's feminine, or he's not manly, he's weak, and it's like that. I think that that's exactly where it is. Like, I think your view of masculinity is incredibly short-sighted, or
Hmm.
very very skewed. Like, it's just it's so narrow-minded that. And again, I understand why, because as a
Hmm.
guy, if you're struggling with your masculinity, and let's say, hey, I feel like a man when I'm like doing more stereotypical male behaviors, wearing certain clothes, lifting, or doing whatever. And then you see
Mm,
another guy doing something that's the antithesis of that, or like the
mm,
opposite of it. And people are saying that's like it's masculine, or like people are trying to imply it's masculine. It's
mm,
not that your sense of masculinity is being threatened or demonized, but almost in a
mm,
sense put into question. It's like kind of, it's sort of like, what's the word I'm looking for? It's sort of like shaking the foundation of your masculinity.
mm,
Because if you start to question, oh well, I've defined my masculinity based on, certain behaviors and certain hobbies and certain clothes I wear. But if now
mm,
society is telling me this actually isn't what defines me as a man, well, now I feel less like a man. And now I feel like my masculinity is being put into question, which comes off as sort of like an emotional response of hostility, which is
mm.
why I think a lot of guys, on the whole, like when a lot of guys say like masculinity is being demonized, I think that's sort of where it's coming from. Of course, like again, like we all agree there are like some like crazy ass rad femmes who are like, oh man, a rapist, and like psycho
Mm,
bitches like that. We like
mm.
absolutely, but like in terms of like a larger societal thing, I wonder if like a lot of guys, it's not so much that masculinity is demonized, it's the uprooting of what we define as masculinity being questioned is making a lot of
Uh,
guys sort of anxious.
I think in this life, I've realized so far that a lot of people don't go far with their thinking. A lot of it is going to be short-sighted, whether that be because you don't have enough time to, in your personal life, to really try and think of the like really go into the philosophy of what you think, like the moral or the real value of what it is. Or I don't know, maybe you're a bad faith actor, but a lot of people are very short-sighted. And I feel like you saying like the whole Harry Styles thing of there's all of these traits that would be defined as masculine, but on the surface you see that he's wearing a dress or you see that he's wearing a blouse or some goofy shit, and you're like, well, that's not that he's not masculine. Well, a lot of people haven't learned or not learned. I can't say that. I don't want to sound like we're fucking floating above society here, but a lot of people
They haven't
haven't really
examined their
exactly.
preconceived notions about what a man is.
Us talking about masculinity right now, you ask somebody else like who hasn't really talked about it, or if you just pick them a random person off the street, like on some PragerU shit, you just go to like a college, and then you're like, hey, so define masculinity real quick. You're gonna get a lot of he, hi, ho, and hums. A lot like the better question would then be to ask them of who picture what masculinity is. Now give me that idea. Like that's why we started the conversation and like the first person I thought of is Stone Cold Steve Austin or anybody from the WWE back in the 90s really, where you get that rugged, rigid, I'm gonna like the violent, the I'll beat your ass, like that type of person, the muscles and all that type. Even though funny enough, once again, there a lot of them are wearing what it's called wrestling gear. So they're
Mm-hmm.
wearing tights or they're wearing the Kurt Angle leotard, like the wrestling gear, where off rip, this isn't masculine, but they're doing other things that make you go like these guys are shirtless and all baby oiled up. They look like it looks like the hero of a Tyler Perry play. But
I
it's like
I never understood that about like those guys who were like like these guys in dresses and skirts and makeup are non-masculine or like they're not men. I'm
mm,
like, I don't know, dude. You're the one who's getting triggered over another dude's fashion sense. Like, if we're really gonna play this game, I don't know. It
uh
seems like you're. I don't know, man.
you just got to ask them to think a bit deeper, and it's going to scare the shit out of them. And once again, like I have my own things where I'm very simple. I'm very ooga ooga. Like a lot of females act like this, so I attribute this to femininity or like behavior. A lot of men generally for that I've grown up with act like this, so I more so equate that with masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just on the surface level, obviously we talked deep about it, but on the surface level, this is what I attribute it with. But a lot of people, when you ask them, they haven't gone that far to be like, well, it's the courage, it's this, it's that. It's just it's the violence or
they
the
just think about
the
the men they've seen in media, their influences.
exactly.
Funny enough that you mentioned that about like the Stone Cold Steve Austin thing. Like I even say in my male dating video, when I was a kid, if you asked me what is like the pinnacle of masculinity, I would choose like like a wrestler or like a big tough guy or like Arnold Schwarzenegger. But as I've
Mhm.
gotten older, the example I used was my Uncle Paul, who my dad wasn't really around in my life, but my Uncle Paul was really there for me. Even
Mhm.
though he had two sons of his own, and yet he's like one of the most empathetic. He cries more often than like he cries a lot, like like at a wedding he'll get teary eyed and stuff. And yet when I think about it, like that sort of stuff isn't like he still likes sports and beer, but
Mhm.
but then he also has the other qualities. But like that's not what I'm defining when I say he's my role model in terms of masculinity. I'm thinking more of the
Mhm.
fact that he cares about the people around him. He's dependable. He's
Mhm.
he is there for the people who need him, and that I think, and that has nothing to do with the clothes he wears, or whether someone wears makeup, or what sports they like, or whether or not they do like sports. So I just find it so strange when so many guys label masculinity or femininity based off these like really weird superficial things like sports and clothes and again like particularly with like clothes, which is something that we know throughout history or even different cultures even today varies
Mhm.
wildly. So when guys say
Mhm.
it's like, I think I had a guy say it's like, yeah, like plaid shirt and jeans is objectively masculine, and it's like,
So looking like the
well,
brawny guy,
wait, what?
looking like the brawny guy is masculine.
Yeah, I'm
I
like, I
mean, I
don't
guess
know,
so, sure.
man. Bronny kind
Looking
of
like a
looks like
lumberjack.
Bronny kind of looks like it goes both ways. Like I don't know.
um,
Yeah,
yeah, it's just it's to kind of go with that. Like for me, I didn't have any, unfortunately. Like now thinking about it, like as an adult, the person who I looked up more to wasn't a real person. It was Uncle Phil from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, where
hell yeah,
I
man.
I attribute exactly. There you go. I attribute rest in peace to Phil Avery. By the way, but I attribute him as masculine. Now, obviously, he was a bigger guy, so he didn't have the muscles or anything like that. You could argue because he was a bigger guy, that kind of like bear whole motif or whatever. But a lot of people are like, well, if you don't have muscles, then if you're not working out 20 times a day, 7 days a week, then you might as well kill yourself.
Well,
So I guess like
and also he's someone who was very like that's another thing that I see in a lot of the Reject Modernity videos. Uncle Phil was someone, he was a big guy, but he also was like pretty overweight.
yeah,
And yet these guys would tell you that like being overweight's weakness. It's modernity. It's
yeah.
like, like is being overweight like, is it better to be a healthy weight? Sure, but I don't really judge someone's character based off their weight. Like I don't know.
Mm-mm.
Like I guess like to some extent, like but like in terms of like the greater scheme of what makes up a person, that is such a
Mm-hmm.
small factor in how I would judge a person that I just it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
usually make a difference to me.
It depends on how they live their life from it. Where
Yeah.
if they're like comfortable, where it's not killing them, whether they're overweight or underweight or a good, whatever that good is for their body type, and they're not like what you call complaining about it every day without doing anything. Like that's I'm like, hey, big guy. Like what is it? But like
Yeah, it's
for
like if
yeah,
someone's
for that
like
whole.
if they're like morbidly obese, it's like okay, you clearly
All
need
right,
to like
hold on
change
now,
your
jeez.
lifestyle. But yeah.
Let's go try and get up from bed real quick. Like one of those
Yeah.
what is that show? 1,000 Pound Life or something? Goofy
Oh
stuff.
god, my 600
Uh,
pound life or like whatever those shows are.
uh, that fucking horror show.
The
But
irony is like those people are like laughing their asses off because they literally are just having like their life filmed for like a week out of the year, and like they're probably getting paid
uh
like $1 million for that show.
hopefully here's hoping a lot of those people, which I'm hoping they're because you see a lot of those people that fucking weight they put on, and you're just like, I hope you fucking get 2 million an episode, and then some gastric bypass surgery. Praise God. Um,
So
but
yeah,
yeah.
just to kind of, so I'll let you go in about 15 minutes. I hope that I'm not keeping you. But yeah, so I think we kind of went over a lot of stuff. I think And I think I'm glad that you agree with me, because I don't know if the other guy was going to agree with me. I think when we talk about, and again, that's not me denying that men are not doing well in society. Like, I
Mm,
100% agree with that. But it
mm,
seems to me, based on from talking with men, my own experiences, everything I see in the data in terms of, the issues that men are facing, it
mm,
really seems like the big issue is that men are just they really are trying to find a sense of who they are in terms of being a man, but because that's
mm,
been upended so much, and again, not I don't really think demonized is the right word, again, to some extent, like there is like some like radical feminists who will say shit like that, but on a
mm,
whole I think society is it's just more, there's really not a clear road, like in terms of like femininity it's sort of the same way, but I think on the feminine
mm,
side there's a lot more encouragement for women, there's a lot more
mm,
like women sort of reaching out and like helping other women find their own identity as a female, as
mm,
feminine, whether that means
mm,
they like ballet and like cooking, or whether it means they like football and want to wear like plaid shirts, like there's
mm,
a lot of encouragement on each end. And the irony is that I think for all these guys who, they preach traditional masculinity, one of
mm,
the worst aspects, and actually I want to ask you before to finish up, I'll ask you about toxic masculinity, but
mm,
one of the things I hate, the biggest irony is that a lot of guys who will preach traditional masculinity, one of the
mm,
biggest aspects of traditional masculinity was this idea that men were expendable, that men don't really matter, that they're kind of
mm,
always in service of other people, that
mm.
men should always serve, they should never ask. And the
Yeah.
irony is that the same guys who were sort of like, who were rightfully saying that men are having issues, or like they're having trouble finding their way, are the same guys who the reason that a lot of men are lost is because they aren't being given guidance and help, in
Mm,
part I think because our society still holds that traditional masculine attitude of, well, they're men,
mm.
who cares, or they're men, they'll figure
Yeah.
it out, they're men. And
Yeah, they need to be
that's the big
expendable.
irony.
Um, I think because that's a fair point. Like you go through that a lot. Like one of the jokes from when I was a teen of like the Titanic of like, shit, I'll dress up as a woman and fucking go on that boat. Women, children first, my ass. Like it's it's like
Yeah, that attitude, that like women and children first attitude, is still, even though we know it makes absolutely no sense. Like,
uh
why would a woman's life be more inherently valuable than a man's life? Even today, in our like egalitarian society, for the most part, we still have these sort of like these men are disposable attitudes.
well, here's my thing, right? 'Cause in the beginning I said for my basic definition of masculinity is that men are supposed to be the first protectors and the first teachers of logic and order. Excuse me. And being the protector role, like as a teenager, I'd make those jokes about the Titanic, right? But you bet your bottom, like you bet your ass, if something happened, me, my girl, and my kid were somewhere, and I can either save my life or save theirs, I will. I hope to live. Like I'd hope, I'd hope like God would be like, all right, you passed the test, go ahead to take whatever happens, go ahead and live. But if that not be the case, I will give my life for my kid and my girl. Like I will protect them need be. So I think in terms of like a family situation, that makes sense. Now, in terms of on the street, you, I'd risk my life for a child on the street, for another woman that I don't know. No,
Well, yeah, I
I'm,
think, yeah, because family is different. Because
I'm hood.
the same thing. I think like the same thing. Like a mother would also like give her own life for her child.
Exactly.
However, when it comes to like man woman, I think there are still, even no matter how sort of like an egalitarian our society is today, and like how
Mm,
as much as we're trying to sort of like deconstruct gender roles, they're the remnants of them. The idea that like men are inherently disposable, or like that they should always like sort of, they should always sort of like put the feelings of their woman, or like a woman, before their own. It's
mm.
not good. I think that's actually really bad for a lot of men. And
I I think there's a lot of toxicity that can come from it, and that has come from it. Obviously, I think like there are obviously situations. Like another joke was, I remember I used to listen to Opie and Anthony, like their old playbacks, and Patrice O'Neill was on there. Whereas he's, in my opinion, another, I guess, forefather of this kind of resurgence of kind of like trying to pick up women or even just masculinity in and of its own way. But one of the jokes he would say, or the story that happened was the radio guy, this girl like honked, like somebody was driving really slow, and his girl honked like for him, which then caused the dude in front of them that was driving slow to try and get aggressive. And now the guy is like, my girl almost damn near put me in a situation where I now have to either like get my ass kicked or kick this guy's ass. And I'm like, bitch, why did you do that? And I
Oh, I,
grew up with that. Like, go
I
ahead.
tell my girlfriend that all the time. I'm like, babe, and like she never would do this, but I'm like, if you ever get in a fight at a bar and you pull that shit, like my boyfriend will kick your ass. I am running out of the fuck that door. I don't care if I could. I don't care if I'm bigger than him and I could kick his ass. Like, hey, that's you, man. I'm just trying to have a
Yeah,
beer. I don't want to get into a
yeah.
fight.
Yeah, you better not like. It better be a he legitimately did something wild as fuck. Because if you start some shit, it's the equal world, motherfucker. You
Yeah,
better. I'll
and of
teach
course,
you the Stone Cold Stunner and get through
yeah,
it.
and of course that like factors back into like as we went over earlier, like men are on average much taller and stronger than women, so that also factors in.
Exactly.
But yeah, those attitudes are definitely still present. But yeah,
Yeah.
just to because I don't want to keep you too much longer.
Yeah.
Thanks for hanging out for so long. Great combo. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Thank you, man.
because we've mentioned it, and I think this will be a nice kind of like bow to put on top of this conversation. Um,
Hmm.
Toxic masculinity, because this is something that one of the biggest factors when we're talking about like the idea that like masculinity is being demonized. Toxic masculinity gets mentioned a lot from both sides.
Hmm.
So, and now I have my own the issue with the term I have is that from what I think toxic masculinity is, like how it is actually defined by like actual scholars, like people who use
Hmm.
it in like the like sociology.
You research this for a living, yeah.
Yeah, it means something a lot different than is kind of used colloquially with like SJWs on YouTube.
Yeah.
And I think that's what leads to a lot of confusion. So just to ask you, so what is your feeling in terms of the term, your definition of it, how it's used in everyday life, or yeah.
I've accepted it. I used to. I once again, I was a part of that anti SJW crowd, so I used to despise it. Growing up more, thinking about it a lot more, I think that is a term. I think that is not fair in how like Twitter uses it, but to make it a term in and of itself is fair. Um, in terms of how it's used scholarly, I'm personally am not too sure, but in terms of how it's used on places like social media, I despise it. I feel like it is a another term that they use to dogpile on a group of people who are already still trying to find their way without any sort of real fortitude, without real guidance, for a lot of cases. However, in and of itself, the term isn't. I can see how it's obviously it can be loaded, but I can see also where, like how I used it before for those guys in like the rap video, where it's like toxic masculinity. Like my definition of it is going to be this vague boys trying to act like men, and then I just leave it at that. Of like, it will always end up bad. A boy trying to act like a man will always end up bad. He needs to have that guidance in some form of fashion to become a man, not pretend to be one. So, but
Mm-hmm.
I could just leave that there. If that answers the question, I don't know.
Yeah, so just to answer your question about sort of like in terms of scholarly, it's very similar to like stuff like something like white privilege, which is a
Mm-hmm.
term that I agree with. Like I think it's a thing, but like
Mm-hmm.
it seems like half the people who use it wrong. Like the people who
Yes.
like are like even on the left who use at both sides, right? You'll have like
Yeah.
righties like not know what it means, and you'll have lefties not know what it
I
means.
don't have white privilege.
And then it's like, yes, you have white privilege, and it's like that's not, yeah, but you're not really using it right. Like you don't really
No.
like. I know you're on my quote unquote my side. You're left, like on the left and liberal,
Mm.
but like you're using these terms, and I don't think you know what they mean. It's similar to
Yeah.
like I'm sure like you're familiar. the number of people I have seen throw around the term white supremacy, like just for like
Oh,
a
it's
lot,
fucking
is like,
staggering.
dude, like I agree that white supremacy is a thing and that it's a problem and we have to discuss it.
Mhm.
But the amount of like 18-year-old libs who like just throw that around willy nilly, like
Mhm.
like vanilla ice cream is a sign of white supremacy. Like, shut the fuck up. Like, you have no idea what you're talking about. Oh my god.
it's it's people. It's either bad faith actors, where I feel like as you go through, especially you probably know too, is like going through YouTube phases or just phases of trying to find out who you are politically, philosophically. You find there's a lot of bad faith and fake actors. People don't really believe what they believe, but are fine getting the paycheck, or grifters, or people who are just trying to make their mark however way they can. And then you have those who genuinely believe in what they're spouting, but they're just muddying. They believe in being divisive, so it's like muddying the water. So when they use the term white supremacy, it's like automatically in my head, as a black man, I think of white supremacy as Nazi Germany, as the movie American History X, skinheads, people who just want to see a white ethno state and kick all the other people out of America, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But then
And
you
there
have
are
these other people
smaller
who are like goo goo. We're
yeah,
like,
and
yeah,
there's
vanilla ice cream is terrible. It's like, all right,
and there are
relax.
smaller like aspects to it. Like, so for example, going back about like people who say I'm not racist, but like I don't like it when like black guys wear like certain clothing. Like, that's still
Mm,
kind of bordering it, because it's not like you're hardcore like ethno state, but you're also sort of ascribing certain characteristics and attitudes towards a certain race. And that's kind of what's like can be insidious about it, is the fact that like there can be people who are genuinely not like, they literally don't believe that like white people are better than black people or anything like that,
mm.
but they can hold attitudes that kind of can, when put out into the ether, can kind of support some of these ideas. It's
See,
like you know how it went like with the SJW thing. Kids didn't just watch like a single Ben Shapiro video and like turn into like an alt-right psycho overnight. It was a very slow process of being fed small ideas little by little until it kind of
yes,
led them in a certain direction.
yes. So because with that, I try not to use, because I feel like we also sometimes, because we don't have other terms, or what you call, like, or there might be older terms that we need to update. Like, we shouldn't conflate, like, in terms of, like, because I agree with you, of like there are attitudes that someone can have that like can lead to a bigger narrative, or can go along. But I feel like we need to create different ones where,
Mm-hmm.
let's say we use that white supremacy for some guy saying like, oh, I don't like when black people do this, that, and the third. Like, they use that, right? Where I would agree with you that that is fucked up.
people
Or
people will hear, like Ben Shapiro will hear that and run with it, like or even not even Ben Shapiro, but just like regular people, they'll kind of hear, like they'll think, like, exactly, they'll think that you're comparing that guy to like Hitler, and which you
exactly
aren't, but
where
they'll think that, and then it'll kind of muddy the waters. So I think,
exactly where
yeah,
it's like, and then what the term, not term, but what I was gonna say is, then what do we call it when another race uses that, right? Like, for
yeah,
example, I've heard Asian people and Latinos say the same thing, or say similar things. So it's like, I can't. There will be people on the very far left that are like, well, you guys are just being agents of white supremacy, but then once again, you're muddying the waters and all that type of stuff.
yeah,
So it's
kind
like
of
we
like, because like technically, like, you know, in it reminds me of this sort of like non-related but sort of related. Sometimes I think it does have to do with sort of like America centrism, or whatever it's called,
mm,
like sort of like egocentrism. I remember
mm-hmm,
hearing a story. I don't know if it's even true, but it made me laugh. It was about a bunch of kids from America. They went to Africa on like a mission trip or
missionary trips.
something, and they called the black people there African Americans, because
Mm,
to them African American just meant black.
yeah.
They didn't really think about what they were saying. They didn't think of like,
Mm,
oh, these people have never stepped foot in America, they're not African Americans, they're Africans.
mm.
But they didn't really think of it because they were so. And I think like with a lot of people in, are you in the States, US?
Yeah,
Yeah,
born and raised New York, living in California right now. Give me
oh,
out, please.
gross, I'm Boston, no, I'm kidding. No, like I said, like I was the one kid who didn't give a shit about the Yankee Red Sox rivalry.
You're,
Um,
neither do I. I don't give a fuck. I just find it funny. I like make jokes about I'm gonna go to a Dodger game with a Yankee cap on and get beat up.
based. Well, it's stupid now too because like Boston, like when I was growing up, we hadn't won the series, so we were always framed as like the underdog. But now
Mhm.
we're so fucking rich. Like the Patriots, the Red Sox, they've all
Yeah.
won. Like the Celtics, they had like dynasties, and so it kind of like we're not really the underdog anymore. We can't really
No,
go with that aesthetic
you're
anymore.
no, you guys are part of the great dynasty of like American sports culture, right
Yeah.
next to like New York and California, right there. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah,
Getting
sorry.
off the
So
rails.
sorry, I went off a little bit, but yeah, to wrap it
Yep.
back around the toxic masculinity. So in terms of like toxic masculinity in sort of like a more when it's used like in a more professional academic sense, it
Mhm.
means sort of let's say a young man really wants to maybe he's really into knitting and
Mhm.
he really wants to knit, but in the society they're like, hey, knitting is for girls, and the guy's like,
Mhm.
okay, I guess I will. I'll become a carpenter. I'll work with wood, even though he doesn't like
Mhm.
it. So
Mhm.
that is a case of toxic masculinity in the sense that this guy wants to do something, or rather, he's doing something he doesn't like because he thinks it's what he's supposed to
Supposed to
do as
do.
a man, and it's having a. This is the important part. He's the two big important parts of it are one, the man has to be doing it for that reason, and two,
Mhm.
it is leading to either negative results for him primarily
Mhm.
or others. So
Mhm.
like here's like the problem with a lot of people is they don't factor those both in. So for example, this is how like a bunch of like Twitter idiots will use it. Let's say
Mhm.
you and me are in a bar, and like
Mhm.
I come up to you and I'm like, "Hey, what's up, asshole?" And you like sock me in the face. Now some
Mhm.
people will like, "Oh, it's toxic masculinity." Well, it's like, no, not really. That's not toxic masculinity. That's just like a guy getting aggressive. Now,
Yeah.
if in that moment when I said, "Hey, asshole," and you kind of thought to yourself, oh shit, what am I supposed to? I have to be a man this moment. I have to hit him. I can't just walk away because that's not manly.
Mhm.
And then you punch
Mhm.
me. That would be toxic masculinity because you're trying to act in accordance with this view of masculinity that you
Mhm.
think is masculine. That leads to bad outcomes because because then we get into a fight, we both get our asses kicked, or we both
Mhm.
get kicked out, or something bad happens, and that's toxic
Yeah.
masculinity. Um, the
Mhm.
irony is that that's another big issue with a lot of these sort of like Twitter, like like Tumblr people. I actually think toxic masculinity is far more commonly does a lot of damage to men themselves. If
Yes.
you're a guy and you like want to knit, but you feel like you can't because that's a girl thing, I think that's awful. That's
Mhm.
really bad. Or a guy who
Yes.
like wants to play with his kid at the park, but he feels like he can't because that's not what men do. That's awful. That's
Mhm.
really bad. That's a horrible way to go through life. Or a guy wants to talk
Yes.
about his feelings and you feel like he can't. However, so many people use it poorly or in like the wrong way that it gets completely fucked up, and people just think that like watching football is toxic masculinity. Like, no, like shut the fuck up. Like, no, it's not.
Yeah, I would to cap it off, I would say I can partially agree with that. I feel like in your example of I would say for me, the toxic masculinity part would just be fighting. Like if you said called hey, like originally when you said the like hey asshole, I originally thought like because I have friends who would greet me like that, and how you know how we dudes do sometimes
Yeah,
we're
exactly.
mean for no fucking reason. Like I wouldn't automatically sock you in the face, but I was like, okay, what if you're a stranger doing this and you're trying to start a fight, right? I would say toxic masculinity is you trying to start a fight and not
Because I feel like I have to prove myself.
exactly
Yeah.
you trying to start a fight because you feel like you have to prove yourself, not me fighting back or being uncomfortable because I have to fight back. I feel like that is a reality of life. Especially with because women have to go through certain things too, where in terms of protecting themselves from other women or from men or whatever the case may be. I feel like protecting yourself or no, just protecting yourself isn't a case of toxicity. Now, I think the person who causes that to feel masculine or however females go through their own toxic form of femininity that causes some sort of physical strife, that would be toxic. But
Yeah.
you or me protecting ourselves from this dude that has had one way too many and is doing too much,
Yeah,
I
that's
feel
just
like that'd be toxic. Or
yeah, that's
even
just like a
even
defense mechanism. I think you put it better. You're right.
or
Like, but if a
even like real quick, even like automatically thinking I have to fuck some dude up because he did that would be a form of toxic masculinity. I think you thinking ways to get out of the situation that are respectful to your dignity is a form of, I guess, if we're going to say toxic masculinity, I guess what, like a healthy masculinity. But if
mhm.
the only way you can get out of this situation is to whoop that dude's ass, then you better put some
Exactly.
more
It's a
tie gloves on and get it going.
the that's the big thing that I think a lot of people miss is that the intent really matters. The
Yes.
intent of, and you can't really. The problem there is you can't really determine that just based off of the situation. You have to actually speak to the
All
guy
contact.
and find out his reason for doing something or not doing something. That's what's important.
Exactly. And with that, we agree fucking
Yeah.
heartedly.
Um, and yeah, to your point too, one of the thing that frustrates me is when people say it's like, what about toxic femininity? It's like, well, I actually absolutely think that is a thing. Like, so for
Mhm.
example, even something as simple as if a woman feels like, hey, the same way, like if a guy feels like, hey, I'm a man, so I have to be muscular, and he goes to the gym and fucking kills himself to the point where he's like
Mhm.
passing out or maybe taking steroids, and it's leading to
Uh-huh.
health problems. That's toxic masculinity.
Yes.
It's him pursuing a vision of masculinity that's causing him harm or toxic.
Mhm.
And so
Yes.
on the opposite side, for women, it would be, hey, if you're a woman and you think women have to be skinny, and
Mhm.
you're purging, you're bulimic or anorexic, it's causing
Yes.
you harm. That is toxic femininity. It's a vision of femininity or masculinity that leads to harm for either them or others. And the
I
issue with men, or I think part of the reason why we talk about toxic masculinity more, is that
mm,
in most cases, well, I think in most cases, it's very similar to like the domestic abuse issue with men and women. How
mm,
domestic abuse between men and women is about equal. Men and women are
mm,
about equally as likely to be victims of domestic abuse. However,
mm,
when it comes to the violence suffered from domestic abuse, like physically, women by
mm,
and large face more, which
mm.
makes sense. If a guy and a girl get into a fight,
Yeah.
on average, a woman's probably going to get more damage done
Yes.
on to herself. Now that doesn't mean to say that like women have it worse or men have it worse. Like it's all bad,
It's
but
all
like
based on it's contextual.
it's different. Like if a woman like verbally abuses her husband for like years on end, that isn't
Mm,
as visible as a woman with a black eye. And so in our
yes.
society, we tend to look at the more blatantly destructive results and take that into account. Even though like
Mm,
that woman abusing her husband verbally for years can have horrible effects on him
horrible
mentally,
effects.
it just isn't
Mm,
as visible. That's actually why I think a lot of like I think it's like we obviously should care about domestic violence against women, of course,
mm,
but and not to take anything away from that, but
mm,
the when it comes to more like, or actually not aside from that, just our discussion of mental health in general is, I think, in this
mm.
country particularly, is awful because we don't really
Yes.
see it. We don't see depression. We don't see anxiety. It's so much harder for us to sort of tackle because it's especially for men. It's like it's an invisible killer. Like a lot of men are like
Yes.
silently suffering, and how do we help them if we don't even know they're hurting?
Especially a lot of men think they're suffering, especially in silence, because they think they have to. I remember growing up, my mother was semi-abusive, semi-not. So I don't know how to like go through with that, but a lot of it like would be like verbal, obviously verbal abuse, and a lot of it that men go through, especially young, where the woman will be or your mother will be like, "Hey, uh, don't." Like talk back or anything like that. That's bitch shit. I'm a woman. Men never argue with women. And then you're just kind
Exactly.
of sitting there like, what? Like,
That's
what?
that's another really big thing to discuss, just to like, because I would hope most people would know this, but just to confirm, because this is something I've actually heard from a lot of people, and I have to kind of like check myself because I'm like, I thought this was obvious, but men and women can both perpetuate both toxic masculinity and toxic femininity. So, for
Yes.
example, if like let's say if my girlfriend got into like a fight with a guy and was like, my boyfriend will kick your ass, and then I was like, no,
Mm,
I'm not doing that, and then she was like, don't be a pussy, don't be a coward, she is perpetuating toxic masculinity, because she is perpetuating
Yes.
this idea that as a man you should put your neck on the line to protect me, because that's what men do. So men
Yes.
and women can perpetuate toxic masculinity. And same difference if, like, if I'm a man and I say, hey, women should be docile, like women shouldn't speak up in like the workplace or in the home, the man should lead, and like the woman should listen to the man. And then
Be
women
seen
can
and heard.
also, and women can also echo those same sentiments. So yeah, a lot of people think of it like toxic masculinity, toxic femininity is more of like a men versus women issue, when it's really not. It's more of a, I don't want to say traditionalist, but it's just those who have these toxic views, men and women, and those who know they're toxic and want to try and get rid of them. It's not, and it's a shame how it gets kind of framed as a men versus women debate, because that's such a misguided concept of what causes the issue.
Yeah, it's very, once again, it's just people muddying up the waters of the conversation, where there is a conversation to be had. There is a conversation to really dig deep, and it's uncomfortable and it's all that. But once again, there's those bad faith actors who, through them doing that, are funny enough giving these sexy answers for that, of like, well, it's a men versus women thing. It's men, you need to stop abusing women. Women, you need to stop divorcing men and making them pay alimony. Like, it then devolves, like, there are those issues once again of domestic violence, and maybe we need to figure out court system shit, like with divorce and all that. Those are issues. But in terms of the conversation that gets started of toxic masculinity and toxic femininity, it ends up spiraling, and we end up losing ground, and then people just end up more mad at each other, and it's just very like, well, we didn't cover any fucking ground. Cool,
yeah,
that's
like
cool.
whenever I try to discuss toxic masculinity, I always have to start with, and it really is annoying. I get more mad about it like at the lefties, because every time I try to talk about it, which is something I really like think is an issue and we should discuss, I always have to like qualify by like giving like a 3-minute definition of like just so we're on the same page and we know what we're talking about. Like, because otherwise, if I say toxic masculinity and you think it means one thing and I think it means one thing, we're never going to get anywhere.
Exactly. Where once, I feel like that's how all conversations should be, is with toxics, excuse me, deep topics like this, where, as we can see with the term of masculinity by itself, people have different, they'll be similar in certain ideas, but someone like you and then someone like Fresh and Fit or whatever the fuck, like if you ended up having a conversation with them, you obviously are coming off of two different forms of what you feel like masculinity is. So starting the conversation off of like, okay, can we agree that so and so is this? Now the pain comes when people can't, at least for the sake of the conversation, come to some sort of agreement, and then just have to once again just be irate and Jerry Springer like when it comes to shit like that. But I do get mad at the left. Like, I'm more of a centrist myself. I'm a fence setter. I apologize, but I do get more mad at the left when it comes to these conversations, because it's like throughout all of the 2010s, you've coined a lot of these terms. Now people on the more rational left or the center or the right or even extreme mask off right are trying to have these conversations, and then it's like you muddy up the waters with these teenage ass terms, and now we're just like, all right, now I'm gonna go listen to I don't know, fucking Milo Yiannopoulos make fun of people for like 2 hours for no fucking reason. Like, it's, you muddy up the waters. I see that you're full of shit, and now I'm going to go recede further into my negative. But we had a chance to be like that whole as an idea, like that whole G4 TV nonsense situation of that Frost chick. It was so long ago, and it's so not a thing. But that whole situation, and then not talking, like the people coming out and being like, "Hey, let's talk about it. Let's do this, that, and the third," and her not doing that. Now people have once again gone back into their corners. They're now receding. The people who believe on the right, people believe on the left, and it's like, okay, we can have better conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. Huh. You just put a good idea into my head. Imagine me on a Fresh and Fit podcast. That would be interesting.
Hey, man,
Oh,
go
man.
fucking do it. I've seen weirder people. Take the trip down to Miami, be around all those girls with their tits out. It'll be uncomfortable for you, but fuck it, it'll be funny for me to watch.
Well, it's so like it's funny because even like among people who like are Fresh and Fit fans, one of the biggest things that I heard from them, it's like I feel like every episode they're just saying the exact same things, and it's like yes, that's
Yes.
the entire point. Like they're literally
Yes.
not giving you any new information; they're just reinforcing what you already believe.
Exactly. It's basically, hey, we believe women ain't shit, or this type of woman ain't shit. At least I can't necessarily. I haven't watched too many of their shows to put all which one automatically put them in just this one camp. But we have these negative beliefs of women. Now let's put these women who glorify these, not glorify, who show these beliefs full front. And now you see, aren't we right? We're right. Aren't we right? We're right. And it's like, okay,
It's funny too
let's not
because
do that.
it's funny too because it's like every single time they'll invite on these women who like like most of the girls that come on are like in like they're like 18 to 22, so they really
Yeah.
haven't like thought out these things all that much.
Either.
So they usually don't really fare well. But then when you get a woman on who does, I feel like Myron kicks her out within like 45 minutes. It's like,
It's very like my girl. I remember we tried. There was this guy that I used to follow a lot named Tommy Sotomayor who went on. He's one of like the Black Manosphere guys, and he went on Fresh and Fit. And there was a woman on there. I think not. I don't know if she was Ukrainian or not. Or no, Albanian. She was an Albanian woman, and she was very much like agreeing to an extent with like that whole like fathers should be more in people's lives and their kids' lives, like the general stuff, like like it's culture, like all that type of shit that they usually agree with. And then even at times where I was like, yeah, that makes sense. But like she which recall I think interrupted somebody once, and then Myron was very quick to be like, shut the fuck up, like. And it's like, hey man, could you not kick her out real quick, like you're having a good conversation. Could you just not be as fucking angry? And he's not as angry with the male co-host as he is with the female ones too. So that also kind of begs a question of that own toxic masculinity of like, and I feel that is a form of toxic masculinity of, because we say that women are the weaker sex and men are stronger. You are quicker to be angrier at the weaker person than someone that, or to be more explosive at the weaker person or the person that you have power over in this situation than to be the one that can either equally whoop your ass or equally verbally whoop your ass. So it's very much like that's another form of toxic masculinity right there.
Yeah, it's so funny with that too because it's like it's so funny because like the manosphere is like before Fresh and Fit came around, they had sort of like, well, I should say after Fresh and Fit happened, a lot of people like were like, yeah, and like they had all these, like they had Rolo on and like all like the manosphere people, and then as soon as all that Abra and Preach stuff happened, where like they were DMCing and all this shit, which was like, it's so funny because like here are these guys, we're alpha, we're not emotional, and then like they're throwing a temper tantrum by like and then all the manosphere people are like trying to like save face, and it was kind of it's really funny.
It shows you that as weird and misguided as a lot of leftist languages and even venomous at times, they have a point to an extent, and they have a slight point where they'll fragile masculinity. That is Fresh and Fit in a nutshell, in my opinion. I could be wrong.
You are 100% right. He is like of all the people, like he is like the epitome. Or it's just so funny because it goes back to what we were talking about. If you're someone with real confidence, like really self-assured, you don't have to sort of like, you don't have to like signal that to other people. You don't feel, because like if you're a confident guy, you're just confident. You don't have to make sure everyone thinks you're, it's very similar to, what is it? The person who says, I don't care what other people think is usually
cares what people think.
Is usually the number one, the person who really, really cares what people think. The person who doesn't care what people think doesn't like keeps their mouth shut. Like they don't, because why the fuck would they care whether or not you think that of them?
Exactly.
Myron's like the epitome of that, of the I don't care what you
fragile.
Think. Yeah.
Once I heard him say the sentence of in terms of how much credit I gave him in terms of dealing like that whole men and women conversation, I heard him say, I work too hard to only be with one woman. I kind of was like, or and then once I can't differentiate the two. I think the other guy is Fresh. He goes by. Once I saw all the YouTubers joke on him for his stories of like, yeah, this NBA player or whatever the fuck it was. Like, I had a threesome with this NBA, not whatchamacall. It was some shit where he bonded with some sports guy about like having sex with the same chick, and then like, which is also another form of toxic masculinity to me that I find very prevalent in like rap and like mainstream bling culture of like seeing like that the video vixen or like that one chick that's in almost every video or very well known, but you don't know what the fuck she does, and she's just being passed around by rapper to rapper, and it's very much like that toxic form of masculinity of like, oh, he had sex with her, oh, that's really cool, I gotta have sex with her too now, like that whole like, it's very weird. So like that whole story
Yeah.
Fresh had, I was just like, yeah, these Fresh and Fit guys are loons. Like, I gotta, if I ever watch this shit, I'm watching it with popcorn because I just gotta see how far this can go. Know what I mean?
It's funny that you say it's so, because it's funny too, because like two of the big things when we're talking about like fragile masculinity in the manosphere, one of the big things is like guys will simultaneously say that like women who sleep around are sluts and you shouldn't go for them, but then they'll like define their whole personality over like how many women I fucked.
How you doing
Or another funny one, and this like drives me nuts, because you mentioned it before about like men, like women should stop divorcing their husbands and paying alimony. The irony is that so alimony is not gender specific. Alimony is just whoever the
is the
person
highest
making
earner.
more money is. So it's like, hey, guys, if we promoted women in the workplace and getting higher wages, alimony would probably stop being a thing. And they're like, no, we still want to make more. And it's like, Jesus Christ. Like,
it's very much like, it's one of those situations where it's a lot of people not thinking too deeply, trying to make, it's a lot of short-sighted people trying to make long-term situations or advocate for long-term situations where it's like, they, like you said, like, hey, if we kind of let women, work in the workplace more, which they can, like, it's not like we're sitting here like, yeah, women shouldn't work anymore. Yeah, no. But like, if we kind of like pump up women working in the workplace more and making more money, like I know like the biggest proponent of a woman paying alimony is Mary J. Blige, if I'm not mistaken. I know she fucking wants to OJ her husband every other fucking day, but it's like, it's very much like, hey, then we can have a conversation about what alimony is, how we can be more fair with it, or even like child support, for instance, we can be more fair with it. That's a lot of like MRA kind of discussions that I do agree with, of maybe a man shouldn't have to pay $20,000 a month in alimony. And I'm not saying like the average man is paying that. I know celebrities are, and it's like one of those like, hey, but like even for the average everyday man, like man will get like, have a check for like 1,500 every 2 weeks and then get half that shit garnished for his check. Nah, it's like, fuck. But then once again, the conversation gets muddy where it's like, well, women shouldn't have kids or whatever the fuck, or then women will be like, well, men should just like stop sleeping with a whole bunch of women. And it's like, you guys are kind of partially right, but the energy's all fucked up and off, and it's just a whole bunch of hurt people not having the right conversation. There's a whole bunch of defensive people trying to keep a privilege that's hurting them and hurting society at large.
That's what I don't get either. It's like a lot of the stuff that they preach ends up like is the reason that a lot of like the stuff that they complain about is happening, and it's like, yes, why? Like, it's really confusing. Like, that's kind of what frustrates me a lot about, like you mentioned, like a lot of MRA arguments. Almost all of MRA arguments they say, I actually agree with. I agree with a lot of them. Even like MGTOW, I actually like the philosophy of it. But the problem is that these communities are filled with like a lot of bitterness, and it gives them the right. It allows them to identify the problem correctly, but then when it comes to like them giving the solution, it's like it falls fucked up. It's like way, or like for example, hey, did you know that like currently like wages are stagnating for people like men and women in the workforce? It's like, yeah, absolutely. It's like, and then like manosphere people would be, it's like, well, that was because back in the 60s the woman entered the workforce and doubled the number of people and diluted the shares for everyone. And I'm like, I feel like this is like, I feel like the next thing you're about to say is like women should not be allowed to work, and they're like, no, I'm not saying that. And it's like, You're kind of implying it pretty strongly. I don't
It's like
like how else.
you gotta wag your finger at them like tricky, tricky. I know what you're about to say. I've heard these words before. Stop it. Like,
It's just a weird framing. Like you again, you selected the correct problem, but then when I ask
uh,
you for like what is the cause of that problem, you're like, well, women, of course. And it's like, or like feminism, of course. And it's like, I don't know.
yeah, it's that it's always the energy. It's like you said, like MGTOW. I was like when I was like 16, I was a big proponent of that because it was like men not acting like thirsty fucking mop buckets, or even like not being all fucking incelly and being like, oh well, I can't change my life for shit. It's like, oh, that's wonderful. But then you go around these MGTOW circles, and like you said, it's like a lot of bitterness of like my wife left me or my girlfriend cheated on me, and it's like a lot of like this fucking sucks, but please, like there's a better, like these issues that you say are issues, which I agree are issues. What is the goal that you want to, what's the goal to fix, like how do we fix them, and then what's the goal that you want at the end of the road? Because a lot of the goal is just to fuck over the other side, when in my opinion, I'm a very family oriented man. It should be giving a better emotional, physical, spiritual, if you believe in that, mental foundation for the next generation. Because a lot of these problems with that I cap off of boys acting like men or all that other shit will be fixed if we give a better foundation. But if we're too busy fighting and trying to come up on the other and demonize one another and come up off these terms that are horseshit that we create every other day, then we're just going to continue the cycle, if not make it worse.
Jorge in the chat, Jorge said, "Are you saying women aren't the reason for global warming?" So actually, Jorge, if I don't know if you know this, but back in the '60s, we developed something called birth control for women. And if you weren't aware, birth control usually comes in plastic packages. Now, over time, the accumulation of these plastic packages has actually led to, seeing as they are non-biodegradable,
Oh, shit.
it actually has led to global warming. If we did not develop birth control, if women never received this, we would not have global warming.
Uh,
That is my
that was a
argument,
master
and it
that was
makes
a
sense.
masterful segue. It's like when I was growing up and I was like, as black people, you try and find like ways to like have better self esteem. So you find all these people who just demonize white people for everything. You that like shift was like masterful. It was like my brother, the white man created everything evil into the world, and we have to figure out what we'll do. Like, oh, that was masterful. I got to give you an applause on that one.
That's like goes back to like the whole like thing we're talking about white supremacy. Like I think I remember reading like an actual article that was published. It was a woman who like went on a it was sitting on a black woman sitting on a train, and a white woman like was walking by, and like her bag
Uh-huh.
hit her, and the woman didn't say anything, and she's like,
Uh-huh.
clearly like this was due to like her not caring. If I was a white woman, she would have said sorry. And it's like, bitch, like can we not like there are so many actual issues in regard to racism we can actually discuss. Can we not like humor this? Because you are the type of person who makes us look, when we do talk about like systemic racism, you make us
Uh-huh.
look fucking insane, and you need to
Yeah.
stop it.
It's very much she hit me with, if she was white she would apologize. It's, I've met a lot of people like that. I was raised by a lot of people like that, funny enough, and it's very much you just you just have to not, and this is one thing I obviously do give to the right. I feel like in a lot of circles there is a currency when it comes to these conversations of who could be the biggest victim, and I feel like there's, and not, this isn't the main conversation, but there are those bad faith actors who do that, and when you have that, you're gonna get a lot of people like that woman whose article that you just fucking talked about, where it's like, man, I'd be a lot more like into the racism conversation and go a lot less towards the like Brandon Tatum, Candace Owens, Jesse Lee Peterson side. If you just stopped, stop what? Just stop doing everything. Just stop. Please just stop so we can have a better conversation, please.
Yeah. Hypermelon. Who created global warming? Mankind. Who created mankind? Women. Boom.
Women.
Pwned. If women didn't have uteruses, we would never have any of these problems. If women never gave birth to us, we would never have any of these problems. It's like, well, I guess you're true. It's like, damn right I'm true.
That stays undefeated.
And yeah, so yeah, I said up we wrap up like half an hour ago. And just so final thought, I think that you kind of touch on something interesting, and this is kind of what I fear about the whole sort of like men feeling masculinity is demonized. I feel like
Mhm.
it is for a lot of men, and this is like what I see a lot in the manosphere. It's kind of ironic how they preach masculinity and taking responsibility. However, what
Mhm.
is happening is that in some way, this mentality that masculinity is being attacked is
Mhm.
leading to a lot of men adopting a victim mentality. And when I
Yes.
say a victim mentality, I don't necessarily like obviously if like there are many things like our society is biased against men in many ways and we should point those out and we should fix
Mhm.
them. But
Mhm.
what I mean by a victim mentality is I think a lot of guys are they kind of find comfort in the idea that their misfortune isn't their fault, and it
Mhm.
leads to them not taking the steps to try and alleviate it. Because even,
Mhm.
as someone who I've dealt with mental health issues, and someone told me something that was very something that really helped me. Your issues are not your fault, but fixing your issues is your responsibility. The you're struggling with depression, anxiety, what have you, that isn't your fault and you shouldn't feel guilty.
Mhm.
However, no one can fix these issues for you. You have to be the
Mhm.
one to take a step forward and fix them.
Yes.
You can't just
I
wallow. You
Yeah.
have to do something.
It's very much, and that's a lot of to go into that, like the that make tower incel MR not MRA. I won't even put that on them a lot of the time. But for those communities, they do that where it's very much like a, well, gotta watch out like for those gold digging hoes, and it's like I look at those guys, and if I watch a Fresh and Fit episode, I whatever Myron says, I will tell my son the opposite. Like it was in the hood a big deal. Like one of the things that I was always grown up with, for example, um, was like, oh, women when there were some men in my life, like women are gold diggers, like all that type of stuff. And it's like, okay, so the whole victim thing is, oh, you got to watch out for these gold diggers. Cool. How about we not sleep with the gold diggers specifically? How about we not do that? How about we not talk about or not try to fuck every woman we see? And maybe if we kind of like do what women do and adopt that selection of like, hey, is this woman really like, for me? I'm not telling men to go celibate. I'm not telling men to never have sex. I'm not telling none of that. But how about we, choose better? How about maybe instead of a first night stand, we try not to adopt that as well? I have a penis too. I understand we want to have sex, but let's do better. And then you say that,
Yeah.
and then those men go, what are you, gay? And it's like, all right, cool. The
I
conversation's over.
what the problem in a lot of like that rhetoric, like the Fresh and Fit and all those guys, is that they try to they end up like teaching men like, hey, this is what women are attracted to, and then the women that are attracted to those traits are like very toxic themselves, and then when the
Mm,
guys get fucked over, the same guys are like, see, I told you women were whores. Like
yeah.
you're like it's almost like this cycle where like they set them up to fail just so they'll like come crawling back and watching their content again.
Yeah.
Um, crap, I just had a metaphor that I was gonna use, but I can't remember it. Not the best way to end it, but anyways. Well, thank you, man.
Well,
I don't want to take up any more of your time. Thank you so much
thank you.
because I have had 3 conversations on this live stream channel so far, and
Mm,
you were the
mm.
only one who was not a full fledged lunatic. The last 2 gentlemen I had on were like insane. Like
I gotta watch those.
one was like, what the one on trans pronouns was like a trip. That one was fun, and the one before
Uh,
that, he was like making an argument like, hey, we shouldn't stop guys from bullying gay kids because that will rob the bullies from a learning experience. And I was like, it was weird, I don't know. But something like that. Like at first I thought it was reasonable. It's like, oh, okay, you're saying that like we shouldn't stop the bullying because
oh shit.
it'll give the kid a chance to like
To
defend
like
himself. I was
defend
like,
himself and
yeah,
like learn.
and like I actually like relented. I'm like, okay, actually, you know what? I actually will correct myself and say I agree with that.
Oh,
But
fuck.
then he was like, well, no, because
Uh,
then the bully has to figure out that it's not okay to bully gay kids on his own. You can't tell him that. And I'm like, what the fuck, dude? I was like, wait, that went off the rails, man. Wait a minute.
oh, oh, that is such a like 2000s new metal like what you would call opinion. Oh, we can't stop the bullies from bullying because they have to learn not to bully.
God, that exact,
Oh,
or not even that. That's what I hear all the time. Like, that's like the
oh,
I hate that argument. It's like, well, bad things are gonna happen anyway, so why should we try to stop bad things from happening? It's like, fuck you, dude. Like, that's like the
yeah.
worst attitude I've ever heard in my life. Damn.
I'll say this and I gotta go. I appreciate the time because I'm gonna take my girl to go see the Batman movie. I'm very excited and
Oh hell yeah,
what you
bro. You're
call
going this late?
like it's what time is it for me? Oh, it's like 7 for
Oh,
me. So it's
you're
like
on the West Coast. I was like, damn, you're gonna get out
yeah.
like midnight. Okay. Well,
Fuck no, Batman's not worth that. But
yeah. I'll let
um
you go, man. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Everyone in the chat appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming on.
thank you, man. Have a great day, you guys. Thank you.
You too, man. Take care.
You too, you too.
Excellent, excellent, excellent chat. I'm very glad that we had that gentleman on. I think the first guy would have been like as much as it is fun having like the lunatics on, I kind of enjoy it personally. I know I think for you guys listening, it can be kind of frustrating. I assume that you guys appreciate more productive conversations, and like that one, that was fantastic. We went over so much. We were supposed to only be on for an hour, but we just kept going, and I kept thinking like, oh, I should wrap up, but then we hopped onto another awesome topic, and it just kept going. So like that was badass. That was a great talk. Well, thank you all for joining. I'm gonna call it a night. What else do I got? Anything for the channel? No, not really. Yeah. Oh, just in case anyone's wondering, I don't think anyone cares, but just in case, I was originally going to stream all my Elden Ring gameplay on the channel, but it got to the point where I'm like, hang on, this game is going to be like 60 hours. Like, I think I'm at 60 hours right now, and I play so intermittently. Like, I'll play like 2 hours here, 3 hours here. I realized that it was hard for me to just keep streaming every single like segment. So I was like, screw that. I'm just going to delete them. So, well, again, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to our guest that was an excellent conversation. Hope to do it again soon. And yes, take care, everyone.